"Don't you recognize me, Cowboy? I'm your childhood love," said the Apache beauty. Wild West story. YouTube, https www.youtube.com, watch, VP, DXR2NRMGRHG. Transcript Arizona Territory, 1885. The sky transformed from azure to bruised purple as storm clouds gathered on the western horizon. The scent of rain, a rare perfume in these parched lands, carried on the rising wind. Thunder muttered across the distance like an old man's grievances. Mason Reed stood on his weather-worn porch, hat in hand, watching the darkness advance. At 34 time had etched lines into his face that belonged to a much older man. His eyes gray as the approaching clouds carried shadows that no amount of Arizona sunshine could disperse. His ranch sat in precarious isolation, the last vestige of civilization before the land gave way to what remained of Apache territory. Most folks in Cooper's Crossing called him a fool for living so close to the border. Some said he was haunted, others that he was hiding. Both were true in their own ways. The first fat raindrops struck the hard-packed earth with tiny explosions of dust before the ground could absorb them. Mason inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of moisture meeting thirsty soil. Rain was sacred in these parts, a blessing that transformed the land, if only briefly. He was about to retreat inside when movement caught his eye. A figure stumbled along the fence line, swaying like a wounded deer. Through the thickening curtain of rain, Mason made out a woman's form, her dark hair plastered against copper skin, clothes torn and darkened with what could only be blood. She staggered 3 more steps before collapsing just beyond his gate. Mason hesitated, one hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. In these territories, strangers meant trouble, especially those who arrived half dead. But something in her silhouette struck a chord of recognition that pushed him forward. Perhaps the old instincts that had once made him valuable to the army. Perhaps something deeper. The rain soaked through his shirt as he crossed the yard. When he reached the fallen woman, his breath caught in his throat. Even through mud and blood, he recognized her features: high cheekbones, proud nose, and eyes that had once watched him with childish curiosity from behind her father's shoulder. Kona, he whispered the name, emerging unbidden from a place of buried memory. Blood seeped from a wound in her side, the crimson river thinning and spreading in the rain. Mason glanced toward the road, then back at the woman. Taking her in meant inviting danger to his door. The town barely tolerated his solitary existence. Harboring an Apache would turn tolerance to hostility. Yet, as lightning split the sky and thunder cracked overhead, Mason made his choice. He gathered Kiona into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite her height, and carried her toward the house. Water streamed from them both as he shouldered open the door and laid her on his narrow bed. In the amber lamplight, her injuries revealed themselves fully. A deep gash along her ribs had been poorly bound with a strip of cloth, now saturated with blood and rainwater. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharper than he remembered, telling a story of hunger and hard travel. But it was her hands that caught his attention, calloused and strong with long fingers that he recalled had once crafted intricate patterns and trading beads when she was just a girl of 12. Mason worked efficiently, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made her body tense even in unconsciousness. The gash was deep, but clean, a knife wound, not a bullet. As he threaded a needle to close the worst of it, his hands paused. What he was about to do went beyond simple mercy. It was a choice that could cost him everything he'd built here. More importantly, it forced him to confront the man he'd once been, the young army translator, whose mistranslated words had helped ignite a war that should never have been fought. 14 years earlier, the treaty meeting took place under canvas awnings at the edge of Apache territory. Mason stood beside Colonel Henry Blackwood, nervously translating between the military officers and Chief Nakohe's delegation. At 20, Mason was the youngest man present, proud of his facility with the Apache tongue, eager to prove his worth. "Tell them the new boundary will follow the river to the mesa," Blackwood instructed him. "Their hunting grounds will remain untouched." Mason translated faithfully, watching relief spread across the Apache faces. But then Blackwood slid a different document before him, one where the boundary line had been moved 5 miles east, cutting off vital hunting grounds. "Sign this version," Blackwood said quietly. When Mason hesitated, the colonel added, "That's an order," interpreter read. "The decisions have been made above our pay grade." Mason felt his mouth go dry. "Sir, this isn't what we agreed. Your job is to translate, not negotiate." Blackwood cut him off, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Unless you'd prefer charges of insubordination, or perhaps you'd like to explain to your superiors why you seem to value Apache interests over our own." Behind the colonel, Mason noticed 12-year-old Kiona, watching from beyond the circle of men, her dark eyes curious and trusting. She'd often followed her father to these meetings, fascinated by the proceedings. Once she'd offered Mason a small beaded token as a gift, a gesture of friendship he'd accepted with a smile that now felt like betrayal. "This land is necessary for our expansion." Blackwood continued, his voice softening to a whisper. "Your father was a traitor who understood the necessity of progress, Reed. He would expect you to do your duty." The mention of his father struck home. James Reed had indeed traded with the Apache, but fairly honestly. Would he have approved of this deception? Mason doubted it. But the weight of Blackwood's authority and the invocation of his father's memory pressed down upon him like a physical force. He swallowed hard and did as he was told. The memory dissipated as thunder rattled the windows of Mason's small house. He completed his work on Kiona's wound, bandaging it with clean cloth. By the time he finished, night had fallen completely, and the storm seemed determined to wash away the very land itself. Mason settled into a chair beside the bed, rifle propped against the wall within reach. Sleep would be impossible tonight, with both the tempest outside and the storm of memory raging within. From Kiona's perspective, the world returned in waves of pain. First came the sensation of softness beneath her unfamiliar after weeks of sleeping on hard ground. Then the throbbing ache in her side, duller now but persistent. Finally, the awareness of being indoors, protected from the elements that had been her constant companions. The scents were unfamiliar leather coffee, a man's living space. Yet, there was something recognizable beneath it all, a presence she had not forgotten despite the years. She kept her breathing steady, feigning unconsciousness while she assessed her situation. The Apache did not survive by rushing blindly into the unknown. Through slitted eyes, she observed her surroundings. A small cabin simply furnished. The man sitting vigil nearby, older, now weathered, but unmistakably the young interpreter who had once stood between her people and the blue coats. The man whose words had changed the course of her trib's history. The treaty fragment, hidden against her skin, seemed to burn with importance. Her father's final instruction echoed in her mind. "Find Reed. He alone can confirm what was promised and what was betrayed." As dawn approached, Kiona decided to reveal her wakefulness. Her eyelids fluttered open, meeting the gray eyes of her reluctant savior. For a moment, confusion clouded her face, a deliberate performance to mask her calculations. Then, recognition dawned, followed by a weariness that was entirely genuine. Mason offered water, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation. When she spoke, her voice was rough but clear. each word deliberate. "You don't remember me, but I never forgot you, Interpreter Reed." The words struck him like a physical blow, not just recognition, but accusation. She knew exactly who he was, not just Mason Reed, the rancher, but the man who had served as the Army's mouth and ears during those fateful negotiations. "I remember you, Kiona," he replied quietly, "daughter of Chief Neko." She pushed herself up, slightly wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. "Then you understand why it's strange I would come to you of all people." Mason nodded. "I've been wondering that since I found you." Kiona's eyes held none of the hatred he might have expected. Instead, they carried something more complex determination mingled with what almost looked like hope. "I came because I believe you're the only one who can help me bring justice to my people." Mason frowned. "Justice from me?" "Yes." With effort, Kiona reached for the small pouch that had somehow remained tied at her waist, despite her injuries. From it, she withdrew a folded piece of parchment edges, worn soft with handling. "Because you're the only one who can confirm what this truly says." She handed it to him, and Mason unfolded it carefully. His breath caught as he recognized the document, a fragment of the original treaty between the U.S. government and the Apache tribes. In the margin, pencil notes showed the boundary alterations in Blackwood's precise handwriting with the instruction, "Read to translate as per verbal directive." "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father kept it hidden until his death." Her gaze was unflinching. He always believed the words would matter someday. Mason stared at the damning evidence in his hands. "And if I refuse to help, then I misjudged you," Kiona said simply, "and I will find another way." The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world transformed. Puddles reflected the blue sky like scattered mirrors, and the desert had erupted in a riot of scents. Wet sage, damp earth, and the indescribable perfume of rain-washed air. Mason stood on his porch coffee mug, clutched in hand, watching a red-tailed hawk circle in the distance. Behind him, in the house, Kiona slept again, her body demanding rest to heal. He had not given her an answer yet about the treaty fragment. The document represented everything he had spent 14 years trying to forget: his complicity, his silence, his shame. Inside, Kiona wasn't sleeping at all, but rather observing Mason through the window. In the early morning light, he looked less like the confident young interpreter she remembered, and more like a man carrying a burden too heavy for one person. She understood such burdens. Her own shoulders bore the weight of her people's survival. The sound of hooves pulled Mason from his thoughts. He sat down his coffee and moved his hand to rest near his holstered revolver. Visitors were rare out here and rarely welcome. Sheriff Franklin Walsh rode into view, his bay horse picking its way carefully through the muddy road. At 45, Walsh carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to respect, though Mason had always sensed something calculating beneath his friendly manner. The badge on his chest gleamed in the morning sun, a symbol of authority that meant different things to different people. To Mason, it had always represented a tenuous peace, one he maintained by keeping to himself. "Morning, Mason," Walsh called as he approached. "Quite a storm we had." Sheriff Mason nodded. "What brings you out this way, town still standing?" Walsh dismounted, tying his horse to the fence post. "Town's fine, just making rounds, checking for damage." His eyes scanned the property with practiced casualness. "Everything all right out here? No trouble?" The question carried weight beyond simple concern. Mason kept his face impassive. "Nothing I can't handle. Lost a few fence posts on the north side, but that's all." Walsh nodded, then glanced toward the house. "Heard any news from the Border Army Patrol? Reported some disturbance with the Apache 2 days back. Woman gone missing after some kind of skirmish." Mason's heart thumped harder, but he maintained his composure. "Haven't heard a thing. Been keeping to myself as usual." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, his eyes a washed-out blue that reminded Mason of faded denim, had a way of seeming to see more than they should. "You know, Reed, we've managed to keep peace in this territory for some time now. Delicate balance, though. Wasn't aware keeping peace was your primary concern, Sheriff." Mason replied, his tone neutral but pointed. Walsh's expression tightened slightly. "I've got responsibilities to this town, to everyone in it, including those who pay you best." Mason regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth, but Walsh surprised him by chuckling softly. "We all answer to someone, Reed, even you." He shifted his weight, his spurs jangling softly. "Railroad company men were in town yesterday. They're pushing to buy up more land out this way." He gestured vaguely toward the eastern horizon. "Good money, from what I hear." "Not interested in selling," Mason replied flatly. Walsh shrugged his badge, catching the morning light. "Might not have much choice eventually. Progress is coming, whether we like it or not." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Speaking of progress, Reverend Harwood was asking after you. Says it's been too long since you darkened the church door." Mason suppressed a grimace. Thomas Harwood was the only person in town who knew Mason's past in detail, having served as chaplain during the same Apache campaigns. The Reverend had never betrayed that confidence, but his knowing gaze often made Mason uncomfortable. "Tell him I've been busy," Mason said. "I'll do that." Walsh untied his horse and mounted smoothly. "You see or hear anything unusual, you let me know right away. Times are changing, Mason. Best to stay on the right side of change." As the sheriff rode away, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that the visit had been more than a routine check. Walsh had never bothered to ride all the way out here after previous storms. Inside the house, he found Kiona awake, sitting upright against the wall, a knife in her hand, his own hunting knife taken from the kitchen table. She must have heard the visitor and prepared to defend herself if necessary, the small blade lowered when she recognized Mason. "Sheriff Walsh," Mason explained, pouring her a cup of water, "asking about storm damage." "And about me," Kiona added, her expression knowing they're looking for me already. Mason nodded. "Mentioned a woman missing after a skirmish." "What happened, Kiona?" She accepted the water, drinking deeply before answering. "Government agents came to what remains of our camp." She touched the knife's blade with her fingertip, testing its sharpness. "They claimed they were taking a census, but they were searching for something. When my cousin questioned them, one agent drew his gun. There was a struggle." Her voice remained steady, but Mason noticed how her knuckles whitened around the cup. "3 of my people died. I escaped with this." She gestured to the treaty fragment. "Why were you wounded?" Mason asked. "One of them caught me as I fled." She met his eyes. "I put my knife in his shoulder before I ran." The simplicity of her statement carried the weight of survival. In her mind, Kiona recalled the moment with perfect clarity, the agent's surprise as she turned and struck, the shock in his eyes, as steel met flesh, the warmth of his blood on her hands. She had been raised to respect life, not to take it lightly. But her father had also taught her that survival sometimes required difficult choices. Like the cougar that defended its territory, she had fought when cornered. "The knife struck bone," she added. "He will live, but he will remember." Mason ran a hand through his hair. "The sheriff didn't say it directly, but they know you're somewhere in this area. It won't take long before they start searching houses." "Then I should go," Kiona said, attempting to rise despite the evident pain it caused her. "You wouldn't make it a mile in your condition," Mace encountered. He hesitated, then made a decision he suspected he'd been moving toward since finding her at his gate. There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. If anyone comes searching, that's where you'll hide." Kiona studied him as if trying to read the truth in his face. "Why would you risk this for me, after everything?" Mason looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "Maybe because of everything." The rest of the day passed quietly. Mason tended to his ranch chores, repairing storm damage, while keeping a watchful eye on the road. Kiona slept intermittently, her body fighting to heal. By evening, her fever had risen concerning Mason enough that he placed cold compresses on her forehead and neck. As he worked, she spoke occasionally through the fever's haze, sometimes in English, sometimes in Apache. Once she called for her father, another time she gripped Mason's wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Brother, run," before falling back into restless sleep. In her fever dreams, Kiona walked the landscapes of memory. She saw again the day the soldiers came to enforce the new boundaries her father's face, as he realized the terms had changed from what had been agreed upon. She relived the confusion, then the anger, then the resistance that had led to bloodshed. Most painfully, she saw her brother Takakota, just 17, falling beneath a soldier's bullet when he refused to leave their ancestral hunting grounds. The memories swirled together with her present circumstances, the pain in her side, the unfamiliar ceiling above her, the presence of the man whose words had set these events in motion. In her delirium, past and present merged, making it impossible to distinguish what was real and what was memory. Night fell, bringing a stillness to the land. Mason opened the windows to let the cooler air flow through the house. He sat beside Kiona, wiping her brow and contemplating the strange path that had led them both to this moment. Near midnight, her fever broke. She opened her eyes, clear and alert for the first time since her arrival. "You have questions," she observed, studying his face in the lamplight. Mason nodded. "Many ask them." He considered where to begin. "How did you know where to find me?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "My father kept track of you after you left the army. He said you were the only white man who showed shame for what happened." "He should have hated me," Mason said quietly. "He did for a time." Kiona adjusted herself against the pillow. "But hate is a heavy burden to carry." Eventually he said, "Understanding you was more useful than hating you." "And what about you? Do you hate me?" Her gaze was direct. "I did when I was younger. When I saw what the new boundaries cost us, a shadow passed across her face. My brother died in the fighting that followed. He was 17. Mason hadn't known this. The knowledge settled like a stone in his stomach. "I'm sorry. Words don't return the dead to life," Kiona replied, but without bitterness. "Actions might prevent more deaths." She paused, then added, "Takakota was headstrong, much like our father. When the soldiers came to enforce the new boundaries, he refused to move. Said the land had been promised to us." Her eyes grew distant with memory. He stood his ground, unarmed but defiant. The soldier who shot him was barely older than he was. A boy killing a boy over lines drawn on paper by men who would never set foot on that land. The quiet pain in her voice cut deeper than any accusation could have. Mason found himself wondering if he had met the young man, if perhaps he had been among the Apache children he had seen during his time as interpreter. How many lives had been altered or ended by the words he had mistranslated? "What exactly do you expect me to do with that treaty fragment?" he asked after a long silence. Kiona's gaze was steady. "Tell the truth. Testify that the written words were not what you translated to my father, that the boundary line was changed after the fact, and then what the government won't suddenly return the land because of one man's testimony." Perhaps not, she agreed. But truth has power of its own. And now there's more at stake. She explained what she had learned, that the railroad company was using the fraudulent treaty boundaries to justify seizing additional land, including the last hunting grounds that sustained her people. The few who remained after the fighting have been living on the edge of starvation, she continued. The reservation land cannot support us. If we lose the hunting grounds to the east, there will be nothing left. Mason stood pacing the small room. Care what you're asking? It would mean admitting to a federal crime. I could be imprisoned or worse. Yes, she said simply, just as my people have been imprisoned on barren reservations or worse. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with 14 years of consequence. Mason turned away, looking out the window at the stars scattered across the night sky. I'll think on it, he finally said. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it wasn't a refusal either. For tonight, it was all he could offer. Kiona watched him reading the conflict in the set of his shoulders. She understood better than he might imagine. The path of righteousness was rarely easy or safe. Her own journey here had been fraught with danger and doubt. Many times she had questioned her father's last instruction, wondering if this quest for justice was worth the risk. But each time, the memory of her brother's face and the faces of all those who had died in the aftermath of the treaty had strengthened her resolve. Tomorrow is soon enough for decisions, she said softly. Tonight rest knowing you have already done more than most would. 3 days passed. Mason kept Kiona hidden in his home, tending to her wounds, which slowly began to heal. The fever didn't return, and color gradually came back to her face. They established a cautious routine, speaking little at first, then gradually more as the strangeness of their situation gave way to a tentative familiarity. On the 4th evening, as they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Mason asked a question that had been troubling him. Your English is perfect, better than when I knew you as a girl. Kiona set down her spoon. The mission school. After the reservation, my father insisted I learn the white man's ways and words. Her mouth tightened slightly. He said I would need them to survive in the changing world. In the flickering lamplight, Mason could see both the girl she had been and the woman she had become. Resilient, determined, carrying burdens no one should have to bear. He was a wise man, your father. Yes. A softness entered her expression. He never blamed you personally for what happened, you know. He said you were young and a tool in other men's hands. The words stung, despite their attempt at absolution. He was too generous then. I knew enough to understand, amen, when certain terms were being deliberately misconstrued, I should have spoken up. Why didn't you? The question hung between them, simple, yet devastating in its directness. Mason found himself transported back to that moment of choice, seeing again the cold warning in Blackwood's eyes, feeling the weight of expectation from men whose approval he had craved. Fear, he finally admitted, not of punishment, though that would have come. Fear of disappointing men I respected. Fear of being seen as disloyal. He looked up at her. Foolish reasons that seemed important to a young man seeking approval. Kiona nodded, accepting his answer without comment. After a moment, she asked, What happened to you after you left the army? I couldn't stay, not after seeing what came of that treaty. I drifted for years, tried ranching in Texas, mining in Colorado. He gestured to the simple house around them. Bought this land 4 years ago. It's not much, but it's mine. And you chose to live at the edge of Apache territory, Kiona observed. Why, Mason had asked himself the same question many times. Maybe I wanted to be reminded, or maybe I was waiting for what? He met her eyes. For a chance to make something right, the moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Then Kiona surprised him with a soft laugh. My father would say, "The Great Spirit has a strange sense of humor bringing us together like this." For the first time since her arrival, Mason felt the tension between them ease slightly. Not forgiveness, it was too soon for that, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Later that night, as embers glowed in the small stove, Kiona unexpectedly began to sing. Her voice was low and melodic, the Apache words flowing like water over stones. Mason sat quietly, letting the unfamiliar sounds wash over him. When she finished, he asked, "What was that song?" "A children's song," she replied. "My mother sang it to me when I was small. It speaks of the four directions and the spirits that guard them." Her fingers trace patterns in the air: east, where the sun rises; south, where the warm winds blow; west, where the sun rests; north, from where the cleansing storms come. Mason listened, captivated by the glimpse into a world he had only seen from the outside. "Will you teach me the words?" Surprise flickered across her face, followed by something like appreciation. Slowly, patiently, she began to teach him the first verse, correcting his pronunciation with gentle humor. "No, not Shia, softer, Shia. It means east, but also beginning. In our way, directions are not just places, but states of being." Mason repeated the word, trying to capture the subtle inflection. "Shia." "Better," she nodded approvingly. "You have a good ear for our language. That's rare among your people." "My father traded with the Apache for years," Mason explained. "He taught me some words when I was young. It's why the army recruited me as an interpreter." "And yet, you chose to mistranslate," Kiona observed, though without venom. Mason didn't try to defend himself. Yes, the worst betrayal isn't just of others, but of oneself. Kiona studied him for a long moment. "There is an old story among my people. A young hunter betrays his tribe to gain favor with a powerful shaman from another village. His actions bring suffering to those he loves. In his shame, he exiles himself, living alone in the mountains. Years pass. One day, a child from his tribe becomes lost in a storm and stumbles upon his cave. The hunter has a choice: to remain hidden or to help the child find her way home. What does he choose? Mason asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. He guides the child home, knowing he will face judgment from his tribe. When they arrive, he expects punishment. Instead, the elders tell him that by saving the child, he has begun to restore what was broken. Not erased his sin, but started on the path of making amends. As they sat in the warm circle of lamplight, trading words in her ancient language, Mason felt a shift within himself, as if something long frozen had begun to thaw. In this small moment of cultural exchange, more bridges were being built than in all his years of official translation work. The following morning, Mason rode into town for supplies. He hadn't planned to leave Kiona alone so soon, but they were running low on essentials, and his absence might raise suspicions if prolonged. "I'll be back by midday," he told her. "Keep the doors locked." "If anyone comes, I'll hide," she assured him, her hand instinctively moving to touch the pouch containing the treaty fragment. "I've survived this long by knowing when to become invisible." The small settlement of Cooper's Crossing had grown over the past year with rumors of the coming railroad. New buildings lined the main street, and unfamiliar faces mingled with the town's folk Mason had known for years. He tied his horse outside Thompson's general store, nodding to Mrs. Margaret Thompson as he entered. The widow Thompson had run the store since her husband's death in '79. At 62, she maintained sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. "Mason Reed," she greeted him. "Thought you might have washed away in that storm." "Takes more than rain to get rid of me, Mrs. Thompson," she snorted. "More's the pity." What will you be needing today? Mason listed off his requirements: flour, coffee, sugar bandages, and a length of cotton cloth. Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow at the last items but made no comment as she gathered his order. As she wrapped the goods, she lowered her voice. Railroad men were asking about you yesterday. Mason kept his expression neutral. What for? Didn't say specifically, but they're buying up land all around, offering good money, too. She studied him. You thinking of selling that place of yours, no ma'am? She nodded, seeming satisfied. Good. Too many folks cashing out for promises that might never come true. She leaned closer, her voice dropping further. My herald used to say, beware of men who offer you the future while taking your present. These railroad types remind me of that. Mason appreciated her candor. Margaret Thompson had never been one to bow to pressure or popular opinion. Your husband was a wise man, wise enough to leave me this store instead of a pile of railroad bonds, she replied dryly. She handed him his packages. Oh, and Reverend Harwood asked me to send you his way if I saw you. Says it's important. Mason thanked her and paid for his goods. As he stepped back onto the street, he debated whether to visit the Reverend. Thomas Harwood knew too much about Mason's past to ignore, but any conversation with him risked questions Mason wasn't prepared to answer. Before he could decide, a commotion further down the street caught his attention. A small crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. At the center stood Sheriff Walsh and two well-dressed men whom Mason didn't recognize. With them was a third figure, tall, straight back. Despite his 60-odd years with a bearing, Mason would know anywhere Colonel Henry Blackwood. Mason's blood ran cold. Of all the people who could have come to Cooper's Crossing, Blackwood was the most dangerous. The colonel knew exactly what had happened with the treaty, and if he was here now, it couldn't be coincidence. Blackwood had aged, but his presence remained commanding. Silver had replaced the auburn in his hair and mustache, but his eyes were still the same cold blue, calculating, missing nothing. He wore civilian clothes now, but carried himself with military precision, a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. One of the strangers was speaking loudly enough for his words to carry. Assurance that the railroad's interests will be protected. We have federal backing for this project, and we expect local cooperation. Walsh's response was too low to hear, but his body language suggested discomfort. Mason moved closer, positioning himself at the edge of the onlookers. The Apache woman is a fugitive, Blackwood was saying now. She stole government property and attacked a federal agent. Finding her should be your top priority. The sheriff nodded. We're looking, Colonel, but it's a big territory. Not with that wound, she couldn't get far. The other stranger insisted. Someone's helping her. Helping. I want every ranch and homestead within 20 minutes searched. A cold feeling settled in Mason's stomach. He was about to turn away when he felt a hand on his arm. Reverend Harwood stood beside him, his weathered face grave beneath his white hair. Walk with me, Mason, he said quietly. We need to talk. Mason hesitated, glancing back at the men from the railroad. Now, son, Harwood insisted, his grip tightening slightly. They moved away from the crowd, walking toward the small white church at the end of the street. Harwood waited until they were inside the empty building before speaking. You know why those men are here, he said. It wasn't a question. Mason maintained his neutral expression. Railroad business, from the sound of it. Harwood's pale blue eyes fixed on him. Don't play dumb with me, boy. I know you too well. He sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. They're looking for Chief Nakohe's daughter, and something she took from them. Mason felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice steady. What makes you think I'd know anything about that? Because I know what happened 14 years ago. I know the weight you've carried since. The Reverend moved to sit in one of the pews, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "And because if I were Kiona seeking justice, you're exactly who I'd go to." The church was silent, save for the soft creaking of old wood settling in the morning heat. Light filtered through simple stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the worn floorboards. Mason had never been a religious man, but there was something in this space that demanded honesty. Or perhaps it was just the Reverend's knowing gaze. "What do they want with her?" Mason finally asked. "It's not her they want, it's what she has." Harwood leaned forward. A fragment of the original treaty with Marginalia that proves deliberate manipulation of the terms. Proof that could undermine not just past land seizures, but current ones as well, including the railroad's plans, Mason concluded. Precisely. Harwood looked up at the simple wooden cross hanging above the altar. Those men work for Winston Hollister. He represents Eastern investors in the Southwestern Railroad Company. They've secured rights-of-way across federal lands, but they need private holdings as well. Your ranch is directly in their planned path. Mason absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. And Blackwood, what's his interest? He's representing the War Department's interest in the railroad negotiations, but I suspect his presence is more personal where you're concerned. Harwood's expression darkened. He never forgave you for leaving, you know, said you lacked the moral fiber for difficult decisions. The irony of Blackwood's judgment wasn't lost on Mason and the sheriff in their pocket. I suspect Walsh has been unusually accommodating to their demands. Harwood turned back to Mason. They'll be coming to search your property soon today. Perhaps tomorrow. Why are you telling me this? Mason asked, suspicion edging his voice. You're a man of God sworn to uphold the law. I'm sworn to a higher law than man's, Harwood replied firmly. What was done to the Apache was wrong. I spoke against it then, though few listened. I won't be silent now. He stood approaching Mason. Is she with you? Is she safe? The direct question demanded a direct answer. After a moment, Mason nodded. Relief crossed the Reverend's face. Good. Keep her hidden. I'll do what I can to delay them, but be prepared. He hesitated, then added, There's something else you should know. Blackwood has a personal stake in ensuring that treaty fragment never sees the light of day. After you left, he received a promotion and commendation for his handling of the Apache problem. A successful challenge to the treaty's legitimacy would destroy his reputation and possibly lead to charges. Mason absorbed this new information. He'd kill to prevent that. Yes, Harwood said gravely, he would. The Reverend reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key. There's a trap door beneath the altar. It leads to a tunnel that was used during the early settlement days when Apache raids were common. The other end opens in the dry creek bed east of town. If things go badly, bring her here. I'll help you both get away. Mason took the key, surprised by the Reverend's offer. You'd risk everything. I've lived a long life. Mason made my share of compromises, stood silent when I should have spoken. I won't make that mistake again. Harwood's eyes were clear and determined. Now go and remember the Lord helps those who help themselves, but he expects us to help others too. Mason rode back to his ranch with urgency, pushing his horse harder than usual. The packages from Thompson's bounced in his saddlebags, but his mind was fixed on what awaited him. If the sheriff and Blackwood came searching, they couldn't find Kiona in his house. The root cellar might not be enough. As he approached his property, a plume of dust on the horizon caught his eye. Riders coming fast from the direction of town. His heart sank. They had moved more quickly than Harwood anticipated. Mason spurred his horse to a gallop, racing the last quarter mile to his house. He dismounted before the animal had fully stopped rushing through the door. "Kayo," he called. She appeared from the bedroom, alarmed by his tone. "What's happened? Riders coming. Sheriff Blackwood." "Others, we need to hide you." He moved quickly to the kitchen, pulling up the trap door to the root cellar. "Down here, take water, and stay quiet, no matter what you hear." As Kiona gathered her few possessions, Mason caught her arm. "Blackwood's here in town." Her eyes widened with recognition of the name. "The colonel who ordered you to mistransate." Mason nodded. "If he finds you or that document, he'll destroy both." Understanding passed between them. The stakes had just risen considerably. Kiona clutched the pouch containing the treaty fragment closer to her chest. "If they find me, run. Don't try to fight them." The concern in her voice surprised him. "Let's make sure they don't find you," he replied, and helped her down the ladder despite her protest that she could manage. Her wound was healing, but any strain risked reopening it. "Mason," she said, looking up at him from the dim cellar, "whatever happens, thank you for trying." He nodded once, then closed the trap door, covering it with a small rug and sliding a table over it. He had just enough time to splash water on his face and appear casually occupied when hoofbeats thundered into his yard. Through the window, Mason counted 4 riders, Sheriff Walsh, 2 men in expensive suits, and the unmistakable figure of Colonel Blackwood, still ramrod straight in the saddle, despite the years that had passed. Mason stepped onto his porch, one hand resting near his holstered revolver. "Afternoon, Sheriff. This isn't your usual patrol route." Walsh dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "Mason, these gentlemen are from the railroad company. They have federal authority to search properties in the area." He gestured to the men, Mr. Hollister, Mr. Gant, and Colonel Blackwood. Blackwood's gaze fixed on Mason with recognition that swiftly turned to calculation. "Well, well, Interpreter Reed. It's been a long time." "It's just Reed now," Mason corrected flatly. "I left the Army service many years ago." "So you did." Blackwood smiled thinly, rather abruptly. As I recall, there was something in Blackwood's tone of personal animosity that went beyond professional disagreement. Mason had noticed it 14 years ago, but had been too young, too eager to please to understand its source. Now, with the perspective of years, he wondered if Blackwood's resentment stemmed from recognizing in Mason something he had long ago suppressed in his self-conscience. Hollister, a portly man with an expensive suit and an impatient manner, cut in. "We're looking for an Apache woman, a thief and fugitive. We have reason to believe she may be in this area." "Haven't seen any Apache woman or otherwise," Mason replied evenly. "I live alone." "You wouldn't mind if we have a look around then?" Gant suggested, though his tone made it clear it wasn't a request. Mason hesitated, knowing refusal would only increase their suspicion. "I do mind, but it seems I don't have much choice. Make it quick." The men spread out Gant and Hollister, taking the barn and outbuildings, while Blackwood and Walsh entered the house. Mason followed them inside every muscle tent as Blackwood's eyes swept the small living space. "Modest accommodations," the colonel commented. "Though I see you have bandages and medicine accident-prone, are you?" Mason kept his expression neutral. "Life on a ranch has its hazards." Blackwood moved into the bedroom, noting the rumpled sheets. "You sleep poorly for a man alone." "I wasn't expecting company, or I'd have made the bed," Mason replied dryly. The colonel chuckled, though no warmth reached his eyes. "Still have that insolent streak, I see." He moved to the kitchen, studying the room with careful attention. "You know, Reed, I always wondered why you left so suddenly, promising career, important work. Then, one day, gone." Mason watched as Blackwood circled the kitchen table, the table covering the trap door to the root cellar. I found the work wasn't to my taste after all. Ah, yes, a matter of conscience, perhaps. Blackwood's boot scraped against the edge of the rug. Some men aren't suited for the hard decisions required in taming a wilderness. Mason's hand moved instinctively toward his revolver, but he checked himself. Violence now would only confirm Blackwood's suspicions. The colonel knelt, examining something on the floor. "Interesting," he murmured, fingers tracing what Mason realized with horror were a few drops of blood on the floorboards. Blood from Kiona's wound. Blackwood looked up, triumph in his eyes. "She's been here." Below in the root cellar, Kiona pressed herself against the earthen wall. One hand clasped over her mouth to silence her breathing. The voices above were muffled but distinguishable. She recognized Blackwood's immediately, the same authoritative tone that had commanded the soldiers who'd driven her people from their lands. Her free hand moved to the knife at her belt fingers, tightening around the handle. The wound in her side throbbed painfully, a reminder of her vulnerability. If they found her, she would fight, but she harbored no illusions about her chances against 4 armed men. The treaty fragment pressed against her skin beneath her clothing, its presence a constant reminder of why she had risked everything. "Your father entrusted this to you," she reminded herself silently. "You will not fail him." Above, Mason felt sweat beating on his forehead as Blackwood examined the blood stains. Before he could respond to the colonel's accusation, Walsh called from outside. "Colonel Mr. Hollister, you should see this." Blackwood gave Mason a long look before moving toward the door. "We'll continue our conversation later, Reed." Once they were outside, Mason released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He moved to the window, watching as Walsh led the men to the water trough beside the barn. The sheriff pointed to something on the ground. Footprints, Mason realized with a sinking feeling. Kiona's footprints from when she had helped him carry water yesterday. The men conferred briefly. Then Blackwood looked back toward the house, his expression hardening. Mason knew their search would now be much more thorough. He had minutes at most. Moving quickly to the kitchen, he lifted the trap door. "Kiona, we have to go now." She climbed up, wincing slightly. They found something. Tracks by the barn. Blood on the floor. Mason grabbed a canteen and a small sack of provisions he kept ready for emergencies. "There's a dry wash behind the eastern pasture that leads into the foothills if we can reach it without being seen." They slipped out the back door, keeping low and using the house as cover from the men at the barn. Mason led Kiona toward a stand of cottonwoods that would shield their movement toward the eastern fence line. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the world into a harsh landscape of light and shadow. Mason could feel his shirt sticking to his back, hear the blood pounding in his ears. Beside him, Kiona moved with surprising grace despite her injury. Her steps, quick and silent. They had almost reached the trees when a shout went up. There by the trees, Gant had spotted them. Mason pushed Kiona ahead. "Run for the wash. I'll hold them off." She hesitated for only a second before nodding and sprinting for the dry stream bed. Mason turned, drawing his revolver as the men raced toward him. He fired a warning shot into the air. "That's far enough," he called. "This is private property, and you have no right to pursue this woman." Blackwood had drawn his own weapon. "That woman is a fugitive from Justice Reed. Harboring her makes you an accomplice. The only injustice here is what you did to her people." Mason fired again, this time at the ground near the men's feet, forcing them to scatter for cover. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Time seemed to slow as Mason watched Blackwood take aim, the colonel's face a mask of cold determination. Behind him, Walsh looked conflicted, his hand on his gun, but hesitating to draw against a man he'd known for years. The distraction worked long enough for Kiona to disappear into the brush, leading to the wash. Mason backed away slowly, keeping his gun trained on the men. Blackwood's voice carried across the distance. "You're throwing your life away, Reed, for what? Some misplaced guilt. She'll never forgive you for what happened." The words struck closer to home than Mason cared to admit, but he kept moving. Once he reached the trees, he turned and ran zigzagging to make himself a harder target. A shot rang out behind him, the bullet splintering bark inches from his head. He caught up to Kiona at the edge of the wash, her breathing labored from the exertion and pain. Together, they slid down the embankment into the dry stream bed, using its depth for cover as they moved toward the hills beyond. "They'll bring more men," Kiona said as they hurried along the wash. "Trackers probably." "Dugs," Mason nodded grimly. "I know, but I know these hills better than they do. There's an old mining cabin about 5 miles from here. We can reach it by nightfall if we keep moving." The wash deepened as they followed its course, the high banks providing shelter from searching eyes. The ground beneath their feet was sandy in some places, rocky, in others making progress difficult, but leaving minimal tracks. Above them, a buzzard circled lazily in the cloudless sky, a reminder of the harsh realities of desert survival. As the sun began to set behind them, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, Mason felt a strange lightness despite their dire circumstances. For 14 years he had been running from his past, from his complicity in the betrayal of the Apache. Now he was running towards something, a chance for truth, for justice, perhaps even for redemption. In the gathering dusk, Kiona stumbled. Mason caught her arm, steadying her. Their eyes met briefly, and in hers he saw not just determination and pain, but a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Trust, fragile, but real. "Well, make it," he promised, though he had no right to make such assurances. She straightened, adjusting the small pouch that held the treaty fragment. Their purpose, their burden, their hope. "Yes," she replied simply, "we will." And together they pressed on into the deepening shadows as the first stars appeared in the eastern sky, harbingers of a night that would test them both, and a dawn that promised either justice or destruction. Behind them, the sound of distant hoof-beats carried on the evening breeze. The hunt had begun. The mining cabin huddled against the hillside like a wounded animal, half-collapsed and weather-beaten after years of abandonment. What remained of its roof sagged precariously, and the single window was a dark, empty socket in the weathered boards. But to Mason and Kona, stumbling through the darkness after miles of hard travel, it was sanctuary. "Not much," Mason said, as he pushed open the door, its hinges protesting with a rusty groan. "But it'll hide us for tonight." Kiona followed him inside, her face drawn with exhaustion and pain. The wound in her side had begun bleeding again during their flight, a dark stain spreading slowly across the fabric of her dress. Without comment, she lowered herself onto a rough wooden bench, the only furniture remaining besides a toppled table. Mason struck a match, illuminating the cabin's interior. Dust and cobwebs draped every surface, and small animal droppings scattered the floor. The mine had been abandoned nearly a decade ago, when the silver vein played out, leaving only this forgotten shelter as evidence of human ambition. "I'll block the window," he said, moving toward the empty frame. "Can't risk a fire, but the nights aren't too cold this time of year." Kiona nodded, her fingers already working to unwrap the bandage at her side. Mason watched as she exposed the wound, noticing how she assessed it with clinical detachment. There was no self-pity in her movements, only practicality. "It looks worse than it is," she said, though Mason could see the inflammation spreading around the stitches. The running reopened it. "We should check for scorpions first," Mason said, forcing himself to look away from her injury. They like abandoned places. They worked in silence, Mason covering the window with an old canvas he found in the corner, Kiona sweeping a clear space on the floor with a branch she broke from a scrub pine outside. When Mason finished, he turned to find her examining her wound by the dim light of his match. "Let me see," he said, kneeling beside her. The injury looked angry and red around the edges, though the stitches had mostly held. One had torn during their escape, allowing fresh blood to seep through. "It needs cleaning," Mason said. "The water in the canteen is clean, but we should save it for drinking." "There's a spring about half a mile from here," Kiona replied. "I can smell the water in the air." Mason looked at her with surprise. "You can smell it." A faint smile touched her lips. "My people have survived in this desert for generations. We know how to find water when there seems to be none." She pointed southeast. "The cottonwoods in that direction, they only grow where water runs close to the surface." Mason nodded, impressed, despite himself. He had lived in these territories for years, but still saw the land primarily as an adversary to be conquered. Kiona seemed to read it differently, not as an enemy, but as a living thing with patterns to be understood. "I'll go at first light," Mason promised. He rummaged in the small pack of provisions, producing a strip of jerky. "For now, eat something. We need to keep up our strength." Kiona accepted the offering, breaking it in half, and returning a portion to him. The gesture was simple, but significant. A sharing of resources that acknowledged their mutual dependency. They ate in silence, each lost in thought. "Do you think they're still following?" Kiona finally asked. Mason considered the question. Blackwood won't give up easily, but tracking at night is difficult, even with dogs. He leaned back against the cabin wall. "We bought ourselves some time, at least." "Time for what?" The question hung in the air between them. It was the question Mason had been avoiding since their escape. What exactly was their plan? They couldn't run forever. Eventually, supplies would run out, or Kiona's wound would worsen, or Blackwood would catch up to them. The treaty fragment was evidence of wrongdoing, yes, but who would listen to an Apache woman and a former army interpreter with a tarnished record? "We need allies," Mason said finally. "People who will hear your story and believe it." "The white man's courts have never served my people well," Kiona replied without bitterness, simply stating a fact. "Why would they start now?" Her question cut to the heart of Mason's uncertainty. He had no good answer. "I know one person who might help. Thomas Harwood, the Reverend in Cooper's Crossing. He served as chaplain during the treaty negotiations. He saw what happened." "A preacher," skepticism edged Kiona's voice. "My people have had enough of your missionaries." "Harwood is different," Mason insisted. "He spoke against the treaty's implementation even when it cost him standing in the community. He was the only white man besides me who knew the truth. And yet, he did nothing," Kiona pointed out. "Like you." The accusation stung, but Mason couldn't deny its truth. "Yes, we both failed your people." Kiona studied him in the fading light of the match. "At least you admit it. That's something, I suppose." She shifted on the bench, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. "So we go back to Cooper's Crossing, into the heart of danger." "Not directly. There's a widow who lives at the edge of town, Eleanor Miller. Her house backs onto the creek that runs behind the church. Why would this widow help us?" Mason hesitated. "Her husband died in the Apache conflicts years ago." Kiona's eyebrows rose. "And you think she would shelter me, the daughter of the man your people called the war chief?" "Eleanor's complicated," Mason admitted. "After her husband died, she started asking questions about the war. The answers changed her. I've heard she even defended an Apache medicine woman who came to town a few years back." Kiona's voice sharpened. "You don't know for certain, no?" Mason admitted. It's a risk, but our options are limited. They fell silent again, the magnitude of their situation settling over them like the darkness that enveloped the cabin. Outside, a coyote called into the night, its lonely howl echoing across the hills. Mason found himself wondering if this was how it felt to be hunted. This constant alertness, this awareness of vulnerability. "Sleep," he said finally. "I'll keep watch first." "Wake me in a few hours," Kiona insisted. "You need rest, too." Mason nodded, though he doubted he could sleep with his mind racing through scenarios most ending in capture or worse. He watched as Kiona settled onto the floor, using her arm as a pillow, her breathing gradually deepening into the rhythm of sleep. In the moonlight filtering through cracks in the cabin walls, her face seemed younger, unburdened by the weight she carried while awake. Mason found himself remembering the girl she had been curious, bright-eyed watching the treaty negotiations from her father's shadow. He had failed her then, he would not fail her now. In the distance, barely audible above the night sounds of the desert, came the faint baying of hounds. Dawn broke with the promise of heat, the eastern sky painted in broad strokes of crimson and gold. Mason stood outside the cabin, scanning the terrain below. No sign of pursuit yet, but that didn't mean they weren't coming. Blackwood was nothing if not persistent. Inside, Kiona stirred, wincing as she sat up. The night on the hard floor had done her no favors, and Mason could see the tightness around her eyes that spoke of pain carefully controlled. "I found the spring," he said, holding up the canteen, now full of fresh water. "Drink. Then we'll clean that wound." She accepted the water gratefully, taking measured sips, as though each was precious. In this land it was. "We need to move soon," she said, handing back the canteen. "Those dogs we heard last night will pick up our trail once the handlers reach the wash." Mason nodded. "I've been thinking about that. The spring feeds a small creek that runs down to the valley. If we wade through it for a mile or so, it might confuse the dogs." "Good thinking," Kiona approved. "Water leaves no scent trail," she paused. "But we still need a destination, a plan." Mason knelt beside her, gently removing the makeshift bandage to examine her wound. It looked better in the daylight than he'd feared, red, but not festering. He cleaned it carefully with water from the spring, his fingers working with a gentleness that belied their size. "I think we should try to reach Harwood," he said as he worked. "Not directly too risky, but if we could get a message to him somehow," Kiona hissed as the cold water touched her raw flesh, "and then would hide in his church, while Blackwood tears the town apart looking for us. Harwood might know someone with more authority, a federal marshal, perhaps, someone who could protect you while the treaty evidence is examined." Kiona's laugh was sharp and without humor. "You still believe in your system, even after what you've seen it do." She shook her head. "My father made that mistake. He believed in papers and promises." Mason finished bandaging her wound before responding. "Not all white men are like Blackwood." "No," she agreed, her eyes holding his. "Some are like you." The ambiguity of her statement hung between them. Was it accusation or something else Mason couldn't tell? And Kiona offered no clarification as she slowly rose to her feet. "If we're going, let's go," she said, adjusting her clothing over the fresh bandage. "Standing still only makes us easier to find." They set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridges, making their way carefully down to the spring-fed creek. The water was cold against their skin as they waded into the shallow flow, its clarity revealing every stone and water bug beneath the surface. Kiona moved with determination, though Mason could see how each step cost her in carefully hidden pain. "My brother and I used to fish in streams like this," she said unexpectedly as they rounded a bend in the creek bed. "He was always the better fisherman, more patience." Mason glanced at her, surprised by the personal revelation. The brother you lost. Yes, Takakota. She pronounced the name with a softness that turned it into something sacred. He could stand in the water for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I never had his stillness. You seem plenty patient to me, Mason observed, carrying this mission for so long, waiting for the right moment. That's different. That's purpose, not patience. She looked up at the sky, where a red-tailed hawk circled lazily. Takakota would have been a leader among our people. He had the wisdom for it. Mason heard the unspoken thought. Unlike me, he wondered what burdens Kiona carried beyond the physical, what expectations, what doubts about her own worthiness to carry her father's legacy. I think he would be proud of what you're doing, Mason said quietly. Kiona's eyes remained on the hawk. Perhaps he would say, I'm chasing shadows while our people starve. Is that what you believe? She was silent for several steps. I don't know anymore. When my father gave me this task before his death, it seemed clear. Find justice, restore what was stolen. But justice doesn't fill empty stomachs. It might prevent more from going empty, Mason suggested. If the truth about the treaty comes out, if the railroad's plans are halted, and if they are not, if all this ends with nothing changed, except 2 more graves in the desert. She shook her head. I have followed my father's last wish because I must. But I wonder sometimes if the spirits are laughing at us, at how we chase paper promises while the world moves on without us. The honesty of her doubt struck Mason deeply. Here was no blind idealist, but a woman who questioned her own path, even as she walked it faithfully. It made her courage all the more remarkable. My father used to say that doing right doesn't guarantee winning, Mason said after a thoughtful pause, but doing nothing guarantees losing. A ghost of a smile touched Kiona's lips. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was like yours. They continued downstream in companionable silence, the sun climbing higher overhead. The creek gradually widened as smaller tributaries joined it, deepening from ankle to knee height. They stopped occasionally for Kiona to rest, careful to leave the water only on rocky outcroppings where they would leave minimal tracks. By midday, the creek had carried them several miles closer to Cooper's Crossing, though the town remained hidden behind the rolling hills. They paused in the shade of a cottonwood grove, its roots reaching thirstily toward the water. We should rest through the heat of the day, Mason suggested. Travel at dusk. Kiona nodded agreement, easing herself onto a fallen log. The constant walking had taken its toll. Her face was drawn with fatigue, though she made no complaint. As they shared the last of their meager provisions, Mason's thoughts turned to Blackwood. The colonel's presence in this pursuit was troubling. A railroad land dispute wouldn't typically warrant the attention of someone of his rank and standing. This was personal for him, a chance to bury evidence of his past actions and perhaps settle an old score with the interpreter who had walked away. Tell me about Blackwood, Kiona said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. Mason looked up, surprised. What do you want to know? What kind of man is he beyond the uniform in the orders? Her eyes were shrewd. Know your enemy. That's what my father taught me. Mason considered the question, searching for words to capture the complexity of Henry Blackwood. He's a man who believes absolutely in his own righteousness. The kind who can do terrible things without hesitation, because he's convinced the end justifies the means. A zealot? No, not exactly. He doesn't serve a cause or a god. He serves an idea of progress, of civilization, of the inevitable march of history. Mason frowned, remembering. I once heard him say that the disappearance of the Apache was as natural and necessary as winter following autumn. Kiona's expression remained impassive, but Mason saw the slight tightening of her jaw. "And you admired this man," followed his orders. "I was young," Mason said, the words tasting bitter, and he knew how to make young men feel important part of something greater than themselves. He shook his head. "It's no excuse, but it's how men like Blackwood operate. They use your desire to belong to be valued against you. You speak as if you thought about this often." "Every day for 14 years, Mason admitted, trying to understand how I became someone I never meant to be. Kiona studied him, her dark eyes penetrating. "And have you found an answer?" "Only partial ones," he replied honestly. "I know it began with small compromises, looking the other way, and when something didn't feel right, telling myself I was just following orders, just doing my job." His voice grew quieter. "By the time the treaty came, I was already practiced at silencing my conscience. Yet you left afterward, too late to matter." The bitterness in his voice was directed inward. "Not too late," Kiona corrected gently. "You're here now." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Neither absolution nor accusation, but something more complex, an acknowledgement that paths can change, that redemption begins with a single step in a different direction. Their moment of connection was broken by a distant sound, the baying of hounds, faint but unmistakable. "They found our trail," Mason said, rising quickly. "We need to move." Kiona stood her hand, going instinctively to the pouch containing the treaty fragment. "How far to Cooper's Crossing?" 3 miles, maybe 4. Mason scanned the horizon. "If we stay in the creek, we can reach the edge of town by nightfall." They set off again, moving as quickly as Kiona's injury would allow, the sound of pursuit urging them forward. The creek continued its meandering path toward Cooper's Crossing, carrying them with it toward potential sanctuary or final confrontation. The sun was setting by the time they glimpsed the first outlying buildings of Cooper's Crossing. They had left the main creek an hour earlier, following a smaller tributary that Mason knew would lead them toward the eastern edge of town, where Eleanor Miller's house stood in relative isolation. The baying of the hounds had grown closer, then faded, then returned, suggesting the trackers were having difficulty following their Watermass trail, but hadn't given up the hunt. Mason and Kiona moved with increasing caution as they approached civilization, keeping to the deepening shadows of dusk. "There," Mason whispered, pointing to a modest 2-story house set back from the road. A vegetable garden stretched behind it, running down to the very creek bed they now crouched in. Eleanor's place. Kiona studied the house. A single lamp burned in a downstairs window, casting a warm glow that seemed a promised sanctuary, but she had learned long ago that appearances could deceive. "How do we approach?" "I'll go first," Mason decided. "Eleanor knows me. If there's any danger, I'll signal you to run." He hesitated. "If something happens to me, head for the church. Harwood might help you, even if Eleanor won't." Kiona nodded, her hand briefly touching his arm, a gesture of concern that surprised them both. "Be careful." Mason made his way up from the creek bed, crossing the garden with swift, silent steps. The back door of the house was partially hidden by a trellis of climbing roses, their scent heavy in the evening air. He knocked softly 3 times. After a moment that stretched like eternity, the door opened to crack. Eleanor Miller peered out, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined with the caution of a woman who had lived alone for many years. Mason Reed, surprise widened her eyes. "What in heaven's name? I need help, Eleanor," he interrupted quietly. "I've brought someone who needs shelter, just for tonight." Her expression hardened, eyes darting past him to scan the darkness. "The Apache woman they're hunting." It wasn't a question. Mason nodded, not bothering to deny it. "She has evidence of wrongdoing by Colonel Blackwood and others. Evidence that could prevent more injustice." Eleanor's mouth thinned to a line. Blackwood, that man. She shook her head sharply. Mason, there are search parties all over town. They've been at every house along the main road. Please. Mason said the word foreign on his tongue. He rarely asked for help. She's injured. We have nowhere else to go. Eleanor studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment. My Jacob died fighting the Apache, she said finally, her voice tight. Did you know that I heard? Mason admitted. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring back the dead. Her fingers tightened on the door frame. Why should I risk everything for the daughter of the man who led the raid that killed my husband? The question struck Mason like a physical blow. He hadn't known the specific connection that Kiona's father had been directly involved in the death of Eleanor's husband. The revelation complicated everything. Because what happened to Jacob began with a lie, Mason said after a moment, choosing his words carefully. A lie I helped tell. The treaty that pushed the Apache to violence, I mistranslated it on Blackwood's orders. The boundaries were changed after Chief Nakohi agreed to them. Eleanor's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in her eyes. Harwood told me there was deception involved. He never said you were part of it. I was, Mason admitted, and I've lived with that knowledge every day since. A tense silence fell between them. Then Eleanor sighed a sound of deep resignation. I don't know if I can forgive what happened to Jacob, but I do know that more blood won't bring him back. She stepped aside. Bring her in, but understand this. I'm doing it for the truth, not for either of you. Relief washed through Mason. Thank you. He motioned to Kiona, who emerged from the shadows and crossed to the door with fluid grace despite her injury. As she stepped into the light, her eyes met Eleanor's. For a moment, the two women simply regarded each other, the Apache chief's daughter and the cavalry soldier's widow connected by tragedy. Neither had chosen. I know who you are, Eleanor said, her voice tight but controlled. And who your father was? Kiona nodded once, accepting the unspoken accusation. As I know who your husband was. Another charged silence. Then Eleanor closed the door behind them and bolted it firmly. You can stay until morning no longer. The search parties will be back at first light. The kitchen they entered was warm and fragrant, with the smell of baking bread. A kettle simmered on the cast-iron stove, and bunches of herbs hung drying from the ceiling beams. It was a woman's space lived in and cared for. Sit, Eleanor directed, gesturing to the kitchen table. You both look half dead on your feet. Neither Mason nor Kiona argued. They sank into the offered chairs while Eleanor busied herself at the stove pouring hot water into a teapot. Her movements were brisk, practical, betraying neither hostility nor welcome, just the efficiency of a woman who had learned to manage difficult situations. They've been searching the town and surroundings since yesterday. She informed them, her back turned as she worked. Sheriff Walsh seems reluctant, but that colonel is driving them hard. House-to-house searches begin tomorrow. Has anyone checked here yet? Mason asked. No, they're starting from the town center working outward. She turned, setting cups of steaming tea before them. But it's only a matter of time. Kona wrapped her hands around the warm cup, but didn't drink. Her eyes never left Eleanor's face, studying the older woman with cautious assessment. Why would you help us at all? You have every reason to turn us over. Eleanor sat down across from them, her weathered hands folding on the table. Because I've spent 15 years hating the Apache for what happened to Jacob. It nearly destroyed me. She met Kiona's gaze directly. Then Reverend Harwood began to speak of what really happened with the treaty, how the violence didn't begin with your people, but with broken promises. And you believed him. Skepticism edged Kiona's voice. Not at first, but Thomas has never been one for lying, even when the truth is inconvenient. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. He was there when Jacob died. You know, held his hand at the end. If he says there was wrongdoing behind the conflict, I'm inclined to believe him. She paused, then added more quietly. Besides, hate is a fire that burns the one who carries it. I've had enough of burning. Kiona nodded slowly, a flicker of respect showing in her eyes. My father had a saying, the man who carries vengeance carries a scorpion that stings his own heart. Wise words, Eleanor acknowledged, though they don't make forgiveness any easier. No, Kiona agreed. They don't. The momentary connection between the women was broken when Mason asked, Is there any way to get a message to Harwood? We need his help to reach authorities who might listen about the treaty evidence. Eleanor considered the request. He visits me each evening after Vespers checking on my welfare. Though tonight he may not come, the searches have disrupted the usual routines. She rose, gathering their empty cups. If he does come, we can plan your next steps. For now, you should rest. There's a spare room upstairs where you'll be safe for the night. As she turned toward the sink, her eyes fell on the dark stain at Kiona's side. You're bleeding. It's nothing, Kiona said automatically. The wound reopened during our escape. Eleanor's mouth tightened. Let me see it. I nursed Jacob through 2 campaigns before the last one took him. I know something of wounds. After a moment's hesitation, Kiona allowed the older woman to examine her injury. Eleanor worked with brisk efficiency, removing the makeshift bandage and cleaning the wound with water boiled with herbs from her kitchen bundles. Her touch was impersonal, but gentle professional, rather than warm. You need proper stitches, she pronounced. These are pulling apart. I have a needle and silk thread. She glanced at Mason. Unless you prefer to do it. You seem to know what you're doing, Mason replied, relieved to defer to her expertise. Eleanor nodded and said about gathering her supplies. This will hurt, she warned Kiona. I have no linenum or whiskey to dull it. Pain and I are old acquaintances, Kiona replied evenly. Do what you must. As Eleanor worked threading the needle by lamplight, Mason found himself studying the unlikely scene before him. The cavalry widow tending the Apache chief's daughter, a convergence he would have thought impossible days ago. Yet here they were bound together by circumstances none could have predicted. The sharp knock at the front door shattered the moment. All 3 froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Upstairs, Eleanor whispered urgently, The back bedroom. Go. Mason grabbed Kiona's hand, and they moved swiftly to the narrow staircase as Eleanor smoothed her apron and went to answer the door. They had just reached the landing when they heard the door open below. Sheriff Walsh, Eleanor's voice carried clearly. What brings you here at this hour? Mason pulled Kiona into the indicated bedroom, closing the door silently behind them. The room was small, but neat, dominated by a brass bed with a patchwork quilt. They stood motionless, straining to hear the conversation below. Sorry to disturb you, Mrs. Miller. Walsh's voice drifted up. We're conducting searches for fugitives. Mind if I come in at this hour? Hardly proper. Sheriff Eleanor's tone was reproving. Just following orders, ma'am. Colonel's instructions. Very well, but be quick about it. I was preparing for bed. Heavy footsteps entered the house. Mason and Kona exchanged glances. If Walsh conducted a thorough search, discovery was inevitable. The bedroom offered few hiding places. The bed was too low to conceal them, and the closet too obvious. You live alone, Mrs. Miller. Walsh's voice again. As you well know, Sheriff, since Jacob passed. Noticed you set 3 places for supper. The observation hung in the air, a challenge. A pause, then Eleanor's laugh, brittle but convincing. Oh, that force of habit, I'm afraid. Sometimes I still set a place for Jacob. Foolish after all these years. Mason held his breath. Would Walsh believe such a flimsy explanation? Mind if I look around? The sheriff's voice had hardened slightly. If you must, though, I don't appreciate the implication that I'm harboring criminals. Footsteps moved through the downstairs rooms. Mason glanced around desperately for a hiding place. His gaze fell on the window which opened onto a small roof over the back porch. "This way," he whispered, sliding the window open. They climbed out onto the sloped roof, crouching low to avoid being seen from the ground. The night air was cool against their skin after the warmth of the house. Through the open window they could hear Walsh's boots on the stairs. Mason pulled Kiona closer to the edge of the roof, where the shadow was deepest. They pressed themselves against the rough shingles, scarcely breathing, as the bedroom door opened. The sheriff's silhouette appeared at the window, looking out into the night. For one terrifying moment, Mason thought they'd been discovered. Then Walsh turned away, apparently satisfied that the room was empty. "Sorry for the inconvenience, Mrs. Miller." His voice floated up from downstairs a few minutes later. "If you see or hear anything unusual, you let us know right away." "Of course, Sheriff. Good night." The front door closed. Mason and Kiona remained frozen in place, waiting to ensure Walsh had truly departed. Finally, Eleanor appeared at the window. "He's gone," she whispered. "Come inside, quickly." They clambered back through the window, relief making their movements clumsy. Eleanor was already holding the threaded needle, her expression determined. "We need to finish this," she said to Kiona. "Then you both should rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough." As she carefully stitched Kiona's wound, Mason stood watch at the window, scanning the darkened yard for any sign of the sheriff's return. The tension of the close call had left him wired alert to every sound. "He was suspicious," Mason observed quietly. "Walsh isn't a fool," Eleanor agreed, tying off a neat stitch. "He'll be back with more men next time." "Then we need to leave before dawn," Kiona said, wincing slightly, as the needle pierced her skin again, and go where Eleanor asked, her attention focused on her work. "The territory is crawling with search parties. Reverend Harwood Mason said if we could reach him, use the church as temporary sanctuary. Thomas won't be making his usual visit tonight. Eleanor said he sent word earlier he's been asked to help coordinate search efforts on the west side of town. Blackwood wants every able man involved." Mason frowned. "That complicates things." "Yes." Eleanor tied off the final stitch and began bandaging the wound with clean cloth. "But there may be another way." The old mission trail through Apache Pass. Kiona's head came up sharply. "That's Apache territory." "Precisely." Eleanor said, "The searchers won't follow you there. And beyond the pass lies Silver Creek, where Federal Marshal Porter is currently stationed." "How do you know this?" Mason asked, surprised. "Thomas told me the Marshal is investigating land fraud connected to the railroad." She secured the bandage with a practice twist. "If you could get the treaty fragment to him." "It's risky," Mason said slowly. "The Free Apache bands in that area still consider it their territory. They might not welcome either of us." "They would welcome me," Kiona said with certainty. "I am Nakohi's daughter. But you—" She glanced at Mason, would be another matter. The implication hung in the air. Mason might not survive such an encounter. "I'll take that risk," he said finally, "if it gives us the best chance of reaching the Marshal." Kiona studied him with unreadable eyes. "Are you certain these are not men who forgive easily?" "I'm certain," Mason replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "Some debts can only be repaid by facing those you've wronged." Something shifted in Kiona's expression. Respect, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of his resolve. She nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of decision. "You'll need provisions," Eleanor said, practical as always. "I'll pack what I can spare." As the older woman moved about the kitchen gathering supplies, Mason found himself watching Kiona. There was a new alertness to her, a sense of purpose renewed. The past days had been about flight, about survival. Now they were moving towards something, not just away. "What will you tell Marshal Porter?" he asked her quietly. Kiona's hand moved to the pouch containing the treaty fragment. "The truth. All of it." Her eyes met his. "Including your part." Mason nodded, accepting the implicit warning. "As it should be. You understand what that might mean. Legal consequences, possibly imprisonment." "I've lived with worse punishments these past 14 years, Mason replied. "At least this would be honest justice." Kiona studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him truly for the first time. "You have changed from the young man who signed that treaty." "I hope so," Mason said simply. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. All three froze, exchanging alarmed glances. It was well past midnight. No social call would come at this hour. Eleanor moved to the window, peering carefully around the edge of the curtain. Her face palled. "Blackwood," she whispered, "and he's not alone." Mason's heart sank. The back door now. Eleanor was already gathering their hastily assembled provisions into a sack. "The mission trail begins beyond the south pasture," she whispered urgently. "Follow the creek until it forks, then take the eastern branch. It will lead you to the old Spanish ruins. From there, the trail is marked by cairns." The knocking came again, more insistent. "Mrs. Miller, open up Colonel Blackwood, United States Army." Mason grabbed Kiona's hand, pulling her toward the back of the house. "Thank you," he said to Eleanor, "for everything." The older woman nodded once, her face composed into a mask of determination. "Go. And when you see the marshal, tell him Eleanor Miller says it's time justice was served." They slipped out into the night just as they heard the front door open. Eleanor's voice drifted after them, pitched to carry. "Colonel Blackwood." What on earth? Mason and Kona didn't wait to hear more. They ran across the moonlit garden toward the creek bed, keeping low. Behind them came the sound of boots on the porch. Men's voices raised in command. "Search the house. Check the outbuildings." They reached the shallow creek and splashed into it, using its course as cover as they had before. The church was on the far side of town. They would need to circle wide to approach it unseen. "Mason." Kiona's voice was tight with pain. The sudden flight had reopened her wound. Mason could see the fresh stain spreading across her side, despite Eleanor's careful stitches. "Just a little further," he encouraged, though he knew the south pasture was at least a mile away. "Lean on me if you need to." She shook her head stubbornly. "I can manage." They continued downstream, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. The shouts behind them grew fainter as distance and the sound of running water masked them. Mason began to hope they might escape undetected. Then came the bayanging of hounds closer than before. Blackwood had brought the trackers to town. "They'll find our scent at the creek's edge," Kiona said, her face grim in the moonlight. Mason knew she was right. The dogs would lead the hunters straight to them if they continued along the water. "We need to split up," he decided. "I'll leave obvious tracks heading west. You continued toward the mission trail." "No." Kiona's refusal was immediate and firm. "Together." Remember, the loyalty implicit in her reminder touched him deeply. After all, she had suffered because of him. She refused to abandon him now. Together, he agreed. "But we still need to throw them off our trail." They climbed out of the creek onto a rocky outcropping that would leave minimal tracks. From there, they cut across a fabiu field toward a stand of cottonwoods that marked the beginning of common grazing land. If they could reach those trees, they might find cover enough to evade the trackers until they could continue southward. The dogs were gaining, their excited baying growing louder. Mason could picture Blackwood's satisfaction as the trail grew hot, his determination to reclaim the evidence that could destroy his reputation and career. They reached the cottonwoods just as the moon slid behind a bank of clouds, plunging the landscape into deeper shadow. The timing was fortuitous. In the sudden darkness, they might lose their pursuers. "This way," Mason whispered, guiding Kiona deeper into the grove. The trees here were old, their massive trunks and spreading branches creating pools of absolute blackness beneath them. They moved from shadow to shadow, every sense alert. The dogs' baying had changed tone, more frantic now, suggesting they'd momentarily lost the scent. Mason allowed himself a flicker of hope. If they could just reach the south pasture, a twig snapped nearby. Mason froze, pulling Kiona close against the trunk of a massive cottonwood. They hardly dared breathe, as footsteps approached, a man moving cautiously through the darkness, searching. "I know you're here, Reed," Blackwood's voice came from alarmingly close by. "This game ends tonight." Mason felt Kiona tense beside him. Her hand moved to the knife at her belt, but he caught her wrist, shaking his head in silent warning. Violence now would only bring the rest of the search party down upon them. "Your Apache friend needs medical attention," Blackwood continued, his voice deceptively reasonable. "That wound could turn septic if not properly treated. Come out now, and I give you my word she'll receive care." The offer hung in the air, tempting in its practicality. Mason knew Kiona's injury was serious, the renewed bleeding, the risk of infection, but he also knew Blackwood's word meant nothing. The moment they surrendered, the treaty fragment would disappear, and with it, any chance of justice. Blackwood had moved past their hiding place. His back now to them. Mason could see his silhouette against the faint light from the distant town. A tall figure holding a revolver, moving with the confidence of a predator who knows his prey is cornered. Mason caught Kona's eye and pointed in the opposite direction. She nodded, understanding. Slowly, carefully, they began to edge away from Blackwood, keeping the massive tree trunk between them and the searcher. They had almost cleared the grove when disaster struck. Kiona's foot caught on an exposed root, and she stumbled against a low branch. The resulting rustle was slight, but in the tense silence it might as well have been a gunshot. Blackwood whirled, firing toward the sound. The bullet splintered bark inches from Mason's head. "Run!" he shouted, pushing Kiona ahead of him as they broke from cover. Behind them, Blackwood bellowed for his men, his voice carrying across the night. They sprinted across open ground, heading not for town, but for the dark line of the southern creek that would lead them to the Mission Trail. The sound of pursuit grew behind them, shouts crashing underbrush, the triumphant baying of the hounds now freed to run. Kiona ran with determination, but Mason could see her faltering. Blood soaked the side of her dress now, and her breathing had taken on a ragged quality that worried him. She would not be able to maintain this pace for long. There, he pointed to a small stable ahead, its door hanging partially open. Inside quickly, they ducked into the dimly lit interior, the smell of hay and horses filling their nostrils. 2 horses dozed in their stalls, barely stirring at the intruders. Mason closed the door behind them, searching desperately for a way to barricade it. Up there, Kiona indicated the hayloft with a tilt of her head. "We can pull up the ladder after us." They climbed swiftly, Mason helping Kiona with the last few rungs as her strength began to fail. Once in the loft, they pulled the ladder up after them, laying it flat among the loose hay. Below, they could hear the search party approaching. The dogs would lead them straight to the stable, there was no escaping that. But perhaps, in the confusion of the hunt, there was another possibility. "The horses," Mason whispered, pointing to the two animals below. "If we set them loose, create a distraction." Kiona nodded, understanding, already moving to the edge of the loft where it opened onto the stalls below. She made a soft chirping sound, a gentle call that drew the horses' attention upward. They nickered in response, ears pricking forward with curiosity. The dogs were outside now, scratching frantically at the stable door, baying their discovery. Men's voices called commands, boots crunched on gravel. They had minutes at most. "Now," Mason said, sliding back down the ladder. He moved quickly to open the stall gates, while Kiona remained in the loft, continuing her gentle calling to keep the horses' attention divided between them. The stable door burst open just as Mason slapped the nearest horse on its flank. The animal bolted forward, nearly trampling the first man through the door. The second horse followed, creating momentary chaos as men and dogs scattered to avoid the fleeing animals. In the confusion, Mason scrambled back up the ladder, pulling it up behind him once more. He and Kiona pressed themselves flat against the hay as lantern lights swept the stable interior. "Check the back," Blackwood's voice commanded. "They can't have gone far." Most of the search party rushed through and out the rear door of the stable, following the false trail of the fleeing horses. Only Blackwood remained, his lantern held high as he surveyed the interior with suspicious eyes. "I know you're still here, Reed," he called, his voice echoing in the now empty stable. "Always were too clever for your own good." Mason hardly dared breathe. Beside him, Kiona lay perfectly still, only the faint rise and fall of her chest, betraying that she lived at all. The hay beneath them crackled softly, with every small movement threatening to reveal their position. Blackwood moved methodically around the stable, checking each corner, each shadow. Then his gaze traveled upward to the hoft. "Ah," he said softly, a smile in his voice. "There you are." He raised his revolver, aiming directly at the loft where they lay hidden. Mason tensed, preparing to throw himself over Kiona if the colonel fired. But before Blackwood could pull the trigger, the stable door opened again. Sheriff Walsh entered, his expression harried. "Colonel, we've got the horses," he reported, "but no sign of the fugitives. They must have continued on foot." Blackwood's aim didn't waver. "They're here, Sheriff, in the hoft." Walsh looked up, squinting in the dim light. "You sure about that? Seems awful exposed if they were trying to hide." "I'm sure," Blackwood said coldly. "Get up there and bring them down." The sheriff hesitated, his hand moving to rest on his own holstered revolver. "Now, Colonel, let's be reasonable. If they are up there, they're cornered. No need for more violence. We can talk this through." "Talk?" Blackwood's laugh was sharp and humorless. "With a thief and a traitor? I think not. Now do your duty, Sheriff, or I'll do it for you. My duty is to the law, Colonel, and the law says suspects are brought in alive when possible." The tension between the two men was palpable, thickening the air. Mason saw something he hadn't expected: conflict in the sheriff's face, a reluctance that hadn't been there before. "The law," Blackwood spat the word. "The law has been manipulated to serve power since the beginning of time. Don't pretend your hands are clean, Walsh. I know who pays for your new house." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Careful, Colonel. You're speaking to an elected official. I'm speaking to a man who's made his accommodations with the railroad just like everyone else in this pitiful excuse for a town." Blackwood's voice dripped contempt. "Now step aside and let me finish this." Walsh didn't move. "No shots fired in my jurisdiction without my say-so." "That's final." For a moment, Mason thought the two men might actually turn on each other, the local lawman and the federal agent, each with his own understanding of justice. The standoff stretched taut with possibility. Then a new voice entered the confrontation. "Gentlemen, perhaps I can be of assistance." Reverend Harwood stood in the stable doorway, his clerical collar gleaming white in the lamplight. He stepped forward with the calm assurance of a man accustomed to mediating conflicts. "I believe I can persuade our friends to surrender peacefully," he continued, looking pointedly up at the Hoft. "If you'll allow me a moment." Blackwood's expression darkened with suspicion. "You know where they are." "I know many things," Colonel Harwood replied evenly, "including that there are better ways to resolve this situation than violence." He moved toward the ladder, still lying flat in the Hoft. "Mason, Miss Kiona, will you speak with me?" Mason exchanged a quick glance with Kiona. Her face was pale with blood loss, her eyes fever-bright in the darkness. Whatever happened next, they couldn't keep running. Her strength was failing, and with it, their options. "We're here, Reverend," Mason called, revealing their position. Blackwood's revolver tracked the movement, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Walsh stepped forward deliberately, placing himself in the line of fire. "Lower your weapon, Colonel," the sheriff said firmly. "Let the Reverend handle this." With visible reluctance, Blackwood complied. Harwood nodded his thanks to Walsh before turning his attention back to the Hoft. "Mason, I need you both to come down now," he called. "There's been a development you should know about. Come down." Reverend Harwood called his voice firm but gentle. "I give you my word. No harm will come to you." Mason looked at Kiona, whose face had grown ashen with pain and blood loss. The wound at her side had reopened during their flight, leaving a dark stain spreading across her dress. Her eyes, however, remained clear and resolute. "We need to end this," she whispered. "One way or another." Mason nodded and lowered the ladder from the Hoft. He descended first, every muscle tense, as he surveyed the scene below. Sheriff Walsh stood by the door, his hand resting uneasily on his holstered revolver. Blackwood remained several paces back, his face rigid with barely contained fury. When Mason reached the stable floor, he immediately turned to help Kiona. She moved stiffly, each step visibly painful as she navigated the ladder's rungs. Halfway down, she faltered, her strength finally giving way. Mason caught her before she could fall, feeling the heat of fever radiating through her clothing as he steadied her descent. "She needs medical attention," he said, supporting her weight as her feet touched the ground. "That can be arranged," Blackwood replied coldly. "Once she surrenders the stolen government property." "It's not stolen," Kiona countered, her voice weak but determined. "It belonged to my father. It's our truth." The stable door opened again, admitting another figure, a tall man with silver-streaked beard and piercing eyes. His black frock coat bore travel dust, but the federal marshal's badge on his chest gleamed in the dim light. "What truth might that be?" the newcomer asked, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority. "Marshal Porter." Blackwood's tone soured further. "Your presence is unexpected and unwelcome." "I imagine it would be," Colonel Porter replied evenly, "especially considering the telegram I received describing dubious land acquisitions and the pursuit of an injured Apache woman carrying evidence of treaty fraud." Mason felt a surge of hope at the marshal's words. James Porter's reputation for incorruptibility was legendary throughout the territory. If anyone could stand against Blackwood and the railroad interests, it was him. "Who sent this telegram?" Blackwood demanded. "That's not your concern," Porter replied. He turned his attention to Kiona, his expression softening slightly. "You must be Chief Nakohi's daughter. I knew your father briefly. A man of integrity. As was mine," Mason found himself saying. "He traded fairly with the Apache for years before I joined the army as an interpreter." Porter's gaze shifted to Mason, assessing. "And you would be Mason Reed?" The telegram mentioned your role in this matter as well, Marshal Walsh interjected. Colonel Blackwood has federal authorization to recover stolen government property and apprehend those responsible. Does he indeed? Porter's eyebrows rose. Strange that I wasn't informed of such operations in my jurisdiction. He stepped forward, authority emanating from his tall frame. Miss Kiona is now in federal protective custody as a material witness. As are you, Mr. Reed. Blackwood's face darkened. This is outrageous interference. Interference would be obstructing a federal investigation into treaty fraud. Porter cut him off. Now Miss Kiona clearly requires medical attention. Reverend, is your church available as neutral ground? Of course, Marshal Harwood replied readily. Then let's continue this discussion there, Porter decided. Colonel Sheriff, you're welcome to join us. Unarmed. The command hung in the air, a direct challenge to Blackwood's authority. For a moment, Mason thought the colonel might refuse, might even reach for his weapon. But Blackwood was too shrewd for such an open display of defiance against a federal marshal. This isn't over, he said. Instead, his voice pitched for Mason's ears alone as they filed out of the stable. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dusty street into a furnace. Mason supported Kiona, feeling her struggle to remain upright as they made their slow way toward the church. The heat shimmered off the buildings of Cooper's Crossing, distorting the whitewashed church that stood at the town's eastern edge. Townspeople paused in their activities to watch the strange procession. The federal marshal leading, followed by Mason and Kona, with Reverend Harwood Sheriff Walsh, and a fuming Colonel Blackwood, bringing up the rear. Whispers followed them like dust devils spinning from doorway to doorway. That's the Apache woman they've been hunting. What's Marshal Porter doing here? Railroad won't like this interference. By the time they reached the church steps, Kiona was leaning heavily against Mason, her breathing shallow and quick. The white painted doors stood open, offering blessed shade from the punishing heat. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately, the thick adobe walls insulating against the summer sun. Lay her here, Harwood directed, indicating a pallet already prepared near the altar. Mrs. Miller brought supplies earlier, anticipating your need. Eleanor Miller emerged from the small anteroom, carrying a basin of water and clean cloths. Her face registered surprise at the size of their party, but betrayed no alarm. Well, she said practically, I see we have company. Mrs. Miller, Marshal Porter acknowledged with a respectful nod. I hope we're not imposing. Nonsense, she replied, kneeling beside Kiona with surprising grace for a woman her age. The church belongs to all who seek its sanctuary. The emphasis on the final word was slight, but unmistakable. As Eleanor said about tending Kiona's wound, Porter addressed the assembled group. Now then, I believe there's a matter of evidence concerning the 1871 treaty with the Apache. Alleged evidence, Blackwood corrected sharply. More likely a forgery created to disrupt legitimate land acquisitions. That remains to be determined, Porter replied. He turned to Kiona, who was gritting her teeth as Eleanor cleaned her reopened wound. Miss Kiona, the document your father preserved. Might I examine it? With trembling fingers, Kiona withdrew the leather pouch from beneath her clothing. The simple action seemed to cost her considerable strength, but her eyes remained clear and focused as she handed it to Porter. My father kept this hidden until his death, she said, her voice stronger than her condition suggested. He believed that someday truth would matter more than power. Porter carefully opened the pouch, extracting the folded parchment within. The church fell silent as he spread it on the altar, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows to illuminate the faded ink. Mason moved closer, seeing again the damning evidence of his own complicity, the dual columns of English and Apache text, and in the margin, Blackwood's precise handwriting read, to translate as per verbal directive. This appears to be an authentic section of the treaty, Porter observed, examining the document carefully. The paper, the ink consistency, the official seals, all consistent with government documents from that period. Appearances can be deceiving, Blackwood countered, though Mason detected a note of unease beneath his bravado. The fragment could easily have been altered after the fact. Perhaps, Porter conceded, though the marginalia is particularly interesting. He looked up, fixing Blackwood with a steady gaze. This handwriting bears a remarkable resemblance to your own Colonel. A skilled forgery, nothing more. We shall see. Porter carefully refolded the document. I'll require samples of your handwriting from the period for comparison and the official treaty copy held in territorial records. Those records are sealed, Walsh interjected, by order of the territorial governor. How convenient, Porter remarked dryly. Nevertheless, as a federal marshal investigating potential fraud, I have the authority to examine them. I'll send a telegram immediately to have them dispatched. Mason watched Blackwood's face as Porter spoke. The colonel maintained his composure, but a muscle twitched near his eye. A tell Mason remembered from years ago when Blackwood felt control slipping away. There's the matter of jurisdiction, Blackwood attempted, grasping for leverage. This is a territorial issue, not federal. Treaty enforcement falls under federal purview, Porter replied smoothly, as does fraud involving government documents and officials. He turned to Kiona, his expression softening slightly. Can you tell me how this came into your possession? Eleanor paused in her ministrations, allowing Kiona to speak. Though pale from blood loss, she gathered her strength, her voice carrying clearly in the church's excellent acoustics. My father, Chief Nako, was present at the treaty negotiations. He understood enough English to recognize discrepancies between what was being written and what Mr. Reed was translating. Her eyes flickered briefly to Mason, neither accusatory nor absolving. When the final document was presented, my father insisted on keeping a copy, unusual but not unprecedented. This fragment was his proof that the boundaries had been changed after verbal agreement. And he kept it all these years, Porter asked. Until his death 2 winters ago, Kiona confirmed. His last words to me were to find Mason Reed, the only white man who might confirm the truth. All eyes turned to Mason. The weight of his past pressed down upon him heavier than the Arizona heat. Yet somehow facing it directly felt like liberation after 14 years of evasion. It's true, he said, his voice steady, despite the dryness in his throat. I was ordered by Colonel Blackwood to translate one set of boundaries to the Apache delegation. While the written treaty contained different terms, the land in question included critical hunting grounds that sustained the Apache through winter months. Lies, Blackwood hissed. You're constructing this fantasy to justify your desertion, your failure to fulfill your duty. My duty was to translate accurately, Mason replied evenly. A duty I betrayed when I followed your orders. The confrontation might have escalated further, but a commotion at the church door interrupted them. Margaret Thompson entered, followed by 2 railroad representatives in expensive suits. Pardon the intrusion, Margaret announced, her expression unreadable. These gentlemen insisted on speaking with Colonel Blackwood immediately. The taller of the 2 men stepped forward, his eyes taking in the scene with obvious displeasure. Colonel, a word in private, if you please. Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly and followed the men outside. Through the open doorway, Mason caught fragments of an intense conversation. The words "judge arriving" and "intervention" drifting in on the hot breeze. Margaret approached, giving Porter a quick appraising glance before moving to Kiona's side. Let me see, she said briskly, taking over from Eleanor. I have more experience with knife wounds than most doctors in this territory. As Margaret examined the injury, Porter turned to Mason. I need to understand the full context of these events from the beginning. For the next hour, as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, Mason recounted everything: the original treaty negotiations, Blackwood's pressure, his own complicity, and the aftermath as the Apache realized the deception. Throughout his testimony, Porter listened intently, occasionally asking precise questions that revealed his thorough understanding of territorial politics. When Mason finished, the marshal nodded thoughtfully. And the current situation with the railroad. They're using the fraudulent boundaries to justify further land acquisitions, Mason explained, including my ranch and others along their planned route. The pressure has been significant. The same tactics they've used elsewhere, Porter observed grimly. Buy what they can, intimidate, where they must, all with the veneer of legal authority. The church door opened again, admitting Blackwood and Sheriff Walsh. The colonel's expression had shifted from anger to something more calculated, a look that put Mason immediately on guard. Marshal Porter Blackwood began with forced civility. I've just received word that Judge Holcomb will be arriving tomorrow morning with territorial authority to adjudicate this matter. How fortunate, Porter replied, matching Blackwood's tone. I'm sure the judge will be interested in examining the evidence of treaty fraud. The judge, Blackwood continued smoothly, will also be accompanied by federal representatives with specific interest in recovering stolen government documents and addressing unauthorized interference in territorial affairs. The threat was thinly veiled. Porter's expression remained impassive, but Mason detected a subtle tightening around his eyes. Until then, Blackwood concluded, I suggest we all retire to our respective accommodations, unless, of course, you intend to obstruct the judicial process by removing the evidence or the witnesses from town. The witnesses and evidence remain in protective custody, Porter stated firmly. Here at the church, where I can ensure their safety, Irod's smile didn't reach his eyes. Sheriff Walsh will, of course, maintain a presence outside to assist with that protection. After Blackwood departed, Porter turned to Harwood. Reverend, it seems, will be imposing on your hospitality overnight. The church doors are always open to those in need, Harwood replied without hesitation. I should get back to my store, Margaret announced, having finished rebandaging Kiona's wound. The railroad men have been buying supplies all day, overpaying too. Never a good sign. I'll go with you, Eleanor decided. Need to fetch more supplies if we're to have guests overnight. She glanced meaningfully at Porter. Anything particular you might need? Marshal Porter understood her subtle offer. Perhaps some writing materials. I have reports to prepare. Once the women had departed, Porter moved to the window, watching as Walsh positioned 2 deputies across the street from the church. They're not even pretending anymore, he observed. Those men are there to watch, not protect. What happens now? Mason asked. Now we prepare, Porter replied grimly. Judge Holcomb is firmly in the railroad's pocket. His arrival changes the dynamic significantly. He turned to face Mason and Kiona. We have 3 options. First, remain here and present our evidence to Holcomb, knowing he's predisposed to dismiss it. Second, attempt to leave town tonight, risking confrontation with Walsh's men. Or third, Mason prompted when Porter hesitated. Force a more public reckoning, the marshal finished. One that can't be easily dismissed or covered up. From her pallet, Kiona spoke up, her voice stronger after Margaret's ministrations. My people have a saying, when the hunter and prey meet at the waterhole, neither can claim the advantage. Porter nodded slowly, understanding her meaning. Neutral ground, a public forum. The treaty boundary itself, Kiona suggested, pushing herself up on one elbow, despite her obvious pain. Where the disputed territory begins with witnesses from both sides. A bold move, Porter acknowledged clearly, intrigued. Symbolically powerful. But can you travel in your condition? I've survived worse. Kiona replied with quiet determination. And there's another advantage. My father's cousin leads a free band in the hills beyond the boundary. If word reached them that Nicoy's daughter seeks counsel at the disputed lands, Mason understood immediately. They would come Apache witnesses to stand against Hulkam's authority, creating a situation the territorial papers couldn't ignore. Porter concluded, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Even Hulkam would struggle to dismiss evidence presented before such a diverse audience. But how do we get word to them? Harwood asked practically. And how do we reach the boundary ourselves? With Walsh's men watching, Porter's expression shifted to one of decision. First things first. Reverend, is there anyone in your congregation who hunts in the hills? Someone who could carry a message without arousing suspicion? Young Billy Hawkins, Harwood replied, after a moment's consideration. 17 knows those trails better than most men twice his age. His family's not involved with the railroad, and no one questions a boy hunting. Good. We'll need to get a message to him discreetly. Porter turned to Mason. As for our own journey, we'll need to create a diversion, something significant enough to draw attention away from the church. Before they could develop this plan further, the church door opened again. Eleanor slipped inside, her expression grave. The town's buzzing, she reported. Railroad men everywhere buying drinks, making promises, and there's more. A telegram came for Blackwood. Judge Hulkam is bringing a full judicial party clerk, court reporter, territorial marshals. Moving quickly to establish official authority, Porter observed. Anything else? Margaret overheard the railroad men discussing contingency plans if legal measures prove insufficient. Eleanor's voice lowered. They mentioned having armed men positioned throughout town by morning. The implications were clear. Blackwood and his allies were preparing for any outcome, including violent suppression of evidence that could threaten their interests. As darkness fell, the church took on an ethereal quality in the lamplight. Harwood had successfully dispatched young Billy with a message for Kiona's kinsman, and Eleanor had returned with provisions for their overnight stay. Porter stationed himself near the door, revolver within easy reach, while Mason sat beside Kiona's pallet. "You should rest," he told her, concerned by the fever that still burned beneath her skin despite Margaret's medicines. "There will be time for rest when this is finished," she replied, though exhaustion shadowed her eyes. "Tell me about the boundary lands." "You've been there once, years ago," Mason admitted. "After I left the army, I went to see what had been lost because of my actions." He paused, the memory sharp, despite the passage of time. "It's beautiful country, high desert, meeting pinyon pine forests, mesa formations rising like sentinels. Your people chose well in claiming it." "We didn't choose it," Kiona corrected gently. "The land chose us, showed us how to live within its rhythms." Her voice softened with remembrance. "My brother Takakota knew every spring, every game trail through those hills. When the soldiers came to enforce the new boundaries, he couldn't understand how lines on paper could override generations of stewardship." Mason felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down upon him. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for my part in all of it." "Words without action are empty," Kiona replied, echoing her earlier sentiments. "But you've chosen action now. That matters." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft sounds of Porter pacing near the door, and Harwood arranging bedding on the pews. Outside, the night creatures of the desert began their chorus, cicadas thrumming, coyotes calling to one another across the distances. The peace was shattered by a sharp knock at the church door. Porter motioned for silence, his hand moving to his revolver as he approached the entrance cautiously. "Who's there?" he called. "Sheriff Walsh," came the reply. "I need to speak with you, Marshal. Alone." Porter exchanged glances with Mason before carefully opening the door. Walsh stood on the threshold, his expression troubled in the lamplight. "May I enter?" he asked. "What I have to say shouldn't be overheard." After a moment's consideration, Porter stepped aside. Walsh entered, removing his hat. As he crossed into the sacred space, his eyes flicked to Kiona and Mason before settling back on Porter. "Judge Holcomb arrived early," he announced without preamble. "He's meeting with Blackwood and the railroad representatives now at the hotel," and Porter prompted when Walsh hesitated, "and they're planning to convene a special territorial court at dawn. Blackwood has sworn out warrants for the arrest of both Reed and the Apache woman on charges of theft of government property and obstruction of justice." Porter's expression darkened. "Those charges won't stand." Maybe not, Walsh conceded. "But they don't need to stand for long, just long enough to confiscate the treaty fragment and remove it from evidence." He shifted uncomfortably. "There's more. Hulks brought his own marshals, 5 of them. They have orders to place you under restriction for exceeding federal authority in territorial matters." The implications were clear. By morning, their legal position would be untenable, their evidence seized, their witnesses separated and detained. "Why are you telling us this?" Mason asked, suspicion coloring his tone. "You've been firmly in the railroad's pocket until now." Walsh's weathered face tightened. "I've been practical," he corrected. "This town needs the railroad's investment to survive." But he paused, seeming to wrestle with his thoughts. "My father rode with the territorial volunteers during the Apache conflicts. He came home changed, wouldn't talk about what he'd seen. Before he died, he told me the war had been built on lies. Said someday the truth would surface, and when it did, I should remember which side of history I wanted to stand on." The simple confession hung in the air unexpected, and therefore all the more powerful. "What are you offering?" Sheriff Porter asked directly. "A way out of town tonight," Walsh replied. "Before Holcomb can serve his warrants at dawn. I can't openly defy him, but I can ensure my deputies are looking in the wrong direction for a few crucial hours." Porter studied Walsh for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. "And in return—" "Nothing," Walsh said, "except that when this is over and the truth is known, someone remembers I had a choice and made it." The offer presented both opportunity and risk. If Walsh was sincere, they could reach the boundary lands before Holcomb realized they were gone. If he was setting a trap, they would be vulnerable on the open road. "We'll need horses," Mason said, implicitly accepting the offer. "And a wagon for Kona. She can't ride in her condition." "Eleanor Miller's buckboard is behind her house," Walsh replied. "She mentioned it might be useful tonight. Horses are ready at the livery. The owner owes me a favor and asked no questions." The pieces were falling into place with suspicious ease. Porter clearly thought the same. "And Blackwood's men?" the marshal asked. "The railroad security watching the church will be called away to deal with the disturbance at the saloon in 1 hour," Walsh answered. "A rather enthusiastic brawl among some cowhands I deputized for the occasion. It should provide adequate distraction. It was a solid plan, perhaps too solid for something allegedly improvised." Mason exchanged glances with Porter, seeing his own weariness reflected in the marshal's eyes. "Why should we trust you?" Mason asked bluntly. Walsh's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. "You shouldn't," he admitted. "But consider this. If I wanted to betray you, I wouldn't need this elaborate scheme. I could simply return with Holcomb's marshals now and end this standoff." His logic was undeniable, if cold. "Well, take your offer," Porter decided. "But understand this. If it's a trap, my first bullet is reserved for you." Walsh nodded, accepting the terms. 1 hour, he repeated. The back door leads to an alley that runs behind the buildings to the edge of town. Eleanor will meet you at her house with the wagon. He settled his hat back on his head. Good luck. You'll need it. After Walsh departed, they moved with quiet urgency, gathering the few possessions they had and preparing for departure. Mason helped Kiona sit up, concerned by the heat still radiating from her skin. Can you make this journey? He asked softly. I must, she replied simply. There is no other choice now. Porter joined them, his expression grave. I don't entirely trust Walsh, but his offer is our best option. We'll proceed cautiously. And if it is a trap, Harwood asked, voicing the concern they all shared. Then we deal with it, Porter replied grimly. But we can't stay here and wait for Hulkcom's court to convene. That would be surrender, not justice. The hour passed with excruciating slowness, each minute stretching like the shadows cast by the oil lamps. Finally, distantly, they heard the promised disturbance. Shouts and crashes from the direction of the saloon, followed by running feet as the watchers outside the church moved toward the commotion. Now, Porter directed. Mason gathered Kiona in his arms, her weight alarmingly light against his chest. She made no sound, despite the pain movement surely caused her. Her face set in lines of determination as they slipped out the church's rear door into the darkness beyond. The night air carried the scent of sage and dust, cooling rapidly as all desert nights did. Stars blazed overhead, the Milky Way a brilliant swath across the black velvet sky. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now the open space between buildings felt exposed and dangerous as they moved silently through the shadows. They reached Eleanor's house without incident. As promised, she waited with a buckboard wagon, its bed lined with blankets to cushion Kona's journey. A canvas tarp provided concealment from casual observation. Margaret's waiting with horses at the edge of town, Eleanor whispered, as Mason gently laid Kona in the wagon. She'll guide you to the boundary lands by morning. Porter climbed onto the driver's seat, while Mason and Harwood walked alongside, alert for any sign of pursuit. The soft creak of wheels on packed earth seemed thunderous in the quiet night, but the disturbance at the saloon continued unabated, drawing attention away from their escape. At the town's edge, where civilization gave way to the vast openness of the territory, Margaret waited with 4 saddled horses. Her practical face showed no surprise at their arrival, only grim determination. The trail's clear for now, she reported, but we should make distance before they realize you're gone. Mason mounted quickly, positioning his horse beside the wagon where Kiona lay hidden beneath the canvas. Thank you, he said to both women, for everything. Don't thank us yet, Margaret replied, pragmatically. This journey's just beginning, and morning will bring pursuit. Eleanor nodded agreement. We'll delay them as best we can. Buy you time to reach the boundary. As they prepared to depart, Harwood approached Mason's horse. I'm staying, the Reverend announced. Someone needs to face Hulkcom, directly challenge his authority openly. That's dangerous, Porter warned. Perhaps Harwood acknowledged. But if all voices of dissent disappear, Blackwood and Hulkcom will control the narrative completely. I can at least ensure the town hears another perspective. His courage was undeniable. Mason reached down, clasping the Reverend's hand firmly. Be careful, he urged. Blackwood isn't known for his tolerance of opposition. The Lord protects his servants, Harwood replied with quiet confidence, or at least gives them strength to face what comes. He stepped back, raising his hand in blessing. Go with God, all of you. With that final farewell, they set off into the darkness, leaving Cooper's Crossing behind. The wagon wheels whispered over the hard-packed earth, as they followed Margaret's lead toward the east, where the disputed boundary lands awaited. The night journey passed in tense alertness, each sound from the surrounding desert causing hands to move instinctively toward weapons. Porter rode point, his experienced eyes scanning the trail ahead, while Margaret led them unerringly through terrain that would have confounded less knowledgeable guides. Mason stayed close to the wagon, frequently checking on Kiona, whose condition remained stable if not improved. Near midnight, they paused briefly to rest the horses beside a small seeper that emerged from a rocky outcropping. The water tasted of minerals but was cool and clean. As Mason helped Kiona drink, she grasped his wrist with surprising strength. "We're being followed," she whispered. Mason tensed. "You're certain?" "My people learn to feel presence on the wind before we can walk," she replied. "Someone trails us. Has been since we left town." He relayed this information to Porter, who nodded grimly. "I suspected as much," the marshal admitted. "Too much went our way." Walsh's helped the convenient distraction, the clear trail. A trap, after all, Margaret asked, her hand moving to the rifle secured to her saddle. Perhaps Porter acknowledged, or simply caution on Blackwood's part. Either way, we continue as planned, but with greater vigilance. They moved on now, acutely aware of unseen eyes, tracking their progress through the night. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled east, the flat desert giving way to rolling hills dotted with pinon pines and juniper. By the time the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern horizon, they had entered the contested lands, the territory that, according to the true treaty boundaries, belonged to the Apache. Margaret led them to a protected hollow nestled between two rocky ridges. A small stream gurgled through the center, and ancient cottonwoods provided shade and concealment. "We'll rest here briefly," she decided. "The boundary marker is just beyond that rise." She pointed to a prominent mesa silhouetted against the lightening sky. "We should reach it by mid-morning." As they made camp, Mason helped Kiona from the wagon. Her fever had diminished somewhat during the night journey, and though still weak, she insisted on sitting upright against a cottonwood trunk. "My people will come," she said with quiet certainty, gazing toward the distant hills. "They will have seen our dust, heard from the boy who carried my message." "And Holcam's party?" Mason asked, settling beside her. "How long before they realize we've gone?" "They likely already know." Porter interjected, joining them with coffee he'd brewed over their small fire. "The question is whether they'll follow immediately or wait to establish their legal authority first." "Blackwood won't wait," Mason predicted. "He wants that treaty fragment too badly. Holcomb might stay to convene his court, but the colonel will pursue us himself." The boundary marker stood stark against the morning sky, a weathered stone obelisk erected by government surveyors to mark the officially recognized territorial division. According to the fraudulent treaty, everything east of this point belonged to the territory open for settlement and development. According to the true boundaries, Kona's fragment revealed, the line should have been 5 miles further east, encompassing the valuable hunting grounds and water sources vital to Apache survival. They reached the marker by mid-morning, as Margaret had predicted. The sun beat down with increasing intensity as they established their position, setting up what shade they could for Kona, whose strength was returning slowly but steadily. "Now we wait," Porter said, scanning the surrounding landscape. "For allies or enemies, whichever arrives first." They didn't wait long. Before noon, dust rose on the horizon to the west, riders approaching from the direction of Cooper's Crossing. At nearly the same moment, movement appeared on the eastern ridgeline, a small group of mounted figures watching silently from the distance. "Apache," Kiona confirmed, shading her eyes against the glare. "My father's people," and Blackwood Mason added grimly, recognizing the lead rider in the approaching party from town with Walsh and others. As both groups drew nearer, the boundary marker took on greater significance, a physical representation of the divide between worlds, between versions of truth. Porter positioned himself directly beside it, badge prominently displayed, while Mason helped Kiona stand to face the approaching confrontation. The Apache riders descended first, 5 men on small, hearty ponies, their faces weathered and watchful. They carried no visible weapons, but Mason knew from experience that this didn't mean they were unarmed. They halted a respectful distance away, studying the gathered whites with measured caution. One rider moved forward slightly, an older man with silver streaking his long black hair, his face bearing the distinctive high cheekbones that marked Kiona's lineage as well. "None." He greeted her in Apache. "Daughter of my cousin, we received your message." To she replied, inclining her head respectfully, "I am grateful you came." Before further exchanges could occur, Blackwood's party arrived in a cloud of dust and clattering hooves. The colonel led the way, his face dark with fury, followed by Sheriff Walsh and 3 armed men. Mason didn't recognize. Holcomb's marshals, presumably. "This is territorial jurisdiction," Blackwood announced without preamble, reining his horse to a stop. "You are all in violation of judicial orders to appear before Judge Holcomb's court." Porter stepped forward, his badge catching the sunlight. "This boundary is in dispute, Colonel. As such, federal authority supersedes territorial claims until the matter is resolved." Resolved, Blackwood's laugh held no humor. It was resolved 14 years ago. One fragment of questionable providence doesn't change established law. "Then you won't object to examining the evidence in an open forum," Porter countered smoothly with witnesses from both communities affected by the treaty's terms. Blackwood's gaze shifted to the Apache observers, his expression darkening further. "This is an illegal gathering. Those people have no standing in territorial matters. They have every standing in matters that determine their fate." Kiona spoke up, her voice carrying clearly, despite her weakness as they did 14 years ago when you ordered Mason Reed to mistranslate the treaty terms. The direct accusation hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Walsh and his deputies exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly surprised by the specific nature of the charge. "Ridiculous allegations." Blackwood blustered, though Mason detected uncertainty beneath his bravado. "Where's your proof?" In answer, Porter produced the treaty fragment, holding it up for all to see here with your own handwriting in the margin. Colonel read to translate as per verbal directive. One of the Apache riders moved his pony forward, stopping beside Kiona. He studied the document from a distance, then spoke in his native tongue. Kiona translated for the others. He says his father was present when these words were written. He remembers the day clearly, because it was the last time their people knew peace. The simple testimony added weight to the document Porter held. Walsh urged his horse closer, examining the fragment with obvious interest. "That does look like official treaty paper," the sheriff observed, his voice carrying to his deputies. "And that marginalia means nothing." Blackwood cut in sharply. "Ancient history, even if it were true. The territory has developed according to established boundaries for 14 years. Investments have been made, settlements built. You can't simply redraw lines on a map and expect the world to accommodate your grievances." "Not redraw," Mason corrected, stepping forward. "Restore. Return to what was rightfully agreed upon before deception changed it." "And what of progress?" Blackwood demanded. "The railroad that will bring prosperity to every community it touches. Would you sacrifice that for outdated territorial claims? Progress built on injustice benefits no one in the end," Porter replied. "The railroad can still come, Colonel. It simply needs to negotiate fairly for the land it requires, with all parties who have legitimate claims." The standoff continued, tension building beneath the merciless sun. Mason could see Blackwood calculating his options, aware that the situation had shifted beyond his control. With Apache witnesses present, and even his own allies beginning to question the evidence, his position was weakening by the moment. "This isn't over," Blackwood finally said, his voice low with barely contained fury. "Judge Holcomb will hear of this irregular proceeding. Federal authorities will question your jurisdiction, Marshal Porter. And as for you, Reed," his gaze shifted to Mason, hatred burning in his eyes, "your testimony is worthless. The word of a deserter, a man who abandoned his duty." "I abandoned a lie," Mason corrected quietly. "Something you never had the courage to do." For a moment, Mason thought Blackwood might reach for his weapon, might attempt to resolve through violence what he couldn't through authority. But the colonel was too shrewd for such an obvious mistake, especially with witnesses from both communities present. Sheriff Blackwood barked, "We're returning to town. The judge will want a full report of this situation." Walsh hesitated, his eyes moving between Blackwood and Porter, a decision visibly formed in his weathered face. "I think I'll remain here a bit longer, Colonel. Hear the full testimony before reporting to the judge." "Seems only proper, given the seriousness of the allegations." Blackwood's face darkened with comprehension of Walsh's defection. Without another word, he wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward Cooper's Crossing, two of Holcomb's marshals following in his wake. As the dust from their departure settled, Porter turned to the assembled witnesses. Apache riders, territorial sheriff, and townspeople alike. "Now," he said with quiet authority, "let's examine the evidence properly, with all voices heard." Throughout the afternoon, beneath the shade of a hastily constructed awning, Porter conducted what amounted to an informal tribunal. Keona presented the treaty fragment and explained its providence. Mason testified to his role in the mistranslation and the specific directives Blackwood had given. Walsh confirmed that territorial records had always been suspiciously restricted where the Apache treaties were concerned. Most compelling was the testimony of Totocona's kinsman, who recounted through her translation the immediate aftermath of the treaty's implementation. The confusion as Apache families were forced from hunting grounds they'd been promised would remain theirs, the resistance that led to bloodshed, including the death of Keona's brother Takakota. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Porter wrapped the proceedings with a solemn declaration. "Based on the evidence presented, I find compelling reason to believe the 1871 treaty boundaries were deliberately falsified through mistranslation. I will submit a formal report to Washington recommending immediate review of all territorial designations derived from this treaty with appropriate adjustments to restore the original agreed-upon boundaries." He turned to Walsh. "Sheriff, I trust you'll convey these findings accurately to Judge Holcomb and the territorial authorities." Walsh nodded his expression, suggesting he understood the magnitude of what had transpired. "I will, Marshal, though I don't expect a warm reception." "Nor do I," Porter acknowledged grimly. "This is just the beginning of what will likely be a protracted legal battle. The railroad has significant influence in territorial politics and will fight any challenge to their land acquisitions. But the truth is known now," Mason observed. "It can't be buried again so easily." "Truth alone doesn't guarantee justice," Keona reminded him, though her eyes held a new hope that belied her cautious words. "But it's where justice must begin." As twilight gathered, transforming the desert into a landscape of purple shadows and golden light, and unexpected peace settled over the boundary marker. Apache and settler alike remained in proximity, not in perfect harmony, but in a tentative coexistence born of shared witness to truth, finally spoken aloud. Tojo approached Keona as she sat beside the small fire Mason had built. He spoke briefly in their native tongue, then placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of respect and recognition that brought tears to her eyes. "What did he say?" Mason asked when the older man had returned to his companions. "That my father would be proud," Kiona replied softly, "and that no matter what the white man's courts decide, our people will remember what happened here today." She looked up at Mason, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "As will I." The simple statement carried implications beyond its words. Acknowledgement of Mason's part in both the original deception and its eventual exposure. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but understanding of the complex path that had brought them to this moment. Porter joined them, settling beside the fire with a weary sigh. "Walsh is returning to town to report to Hulkcom. The Apache have agreed to send representatives when formal boundary discussions begin." He studied the flames thoughtfully. "It's a start." "What happens next?" Mason asked. "For the treaty review, a long legal process," Porter replied honestly. "For Blackwood, likely a quiet retirement before any formal charges can be brought. Men like him rarely face full accountability. And for us," Mason glanced at Kona, the question encompassing them both. Porter smiled slightly. "That, I believe, is entirely up to you." As stars emerged in the darkening sky above the boundary lands, Mason considered the truth of Porter's statement. For 14 years he had lived in the shadow of his complicity, building a solitary existence at the edge of Apache territory, as if proximity to his sin might somehow diminish its weight. Now, with the truth finally spoken aloud, different possibilities stretched before him, not a ratio of the past, but perhaps a future no longer defined solely by it. Beside him, Kiona gazed eastward toward her people's lands, her expression contemplative. The quest that had brought her to Mason's door had reached its conclusion, but its resolution opened new questions about where she belonged, in a world still balancing precariously between two cultures. "My grandmother had a saying," she said softly, as if sensing his thoughts. "When the river changes course, it doesn't forget where it has flowed, but neither is it bound to follow the same path forever." Mason nodded, understanding her meaning. "Wise words." "Yes," she agreed. "The question now is where our rivers flow next." As night settled fully over the boundary lands, that question remained unanswered. Not from uncertainty, but from recognition that some paths reveal themselves only in the walking. For tonight, it was enough to sit beside the fire between worlds, with truth finally spoken and the possibility of justice, however imperfect, on the horizon. The boundary marker stood sentinel nearby, no longer a symbol of division, but a reminder that lines drawn by men were always subject to revision, when truth demanded it.